Enter the marble chambers of Alexandria on history's most legendary night, where the last pharaoh of Egypt prepares for her final hours with dignity that echoes through eternity. Experience intimate moments of love, loyalty, and courage as Cleopatra transforms political defeat into immortal legend. This isn't just history, it's the human story behind the myth. Water drops. The warm water embraced Cleopatra as evening light filtered through the tall windows of her private bathing chamber, casting golden patterns across marble walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of royal preparation. Fabric rustling. She had performed this ritual thousands of times. The careful arrangement of rose petals, the precise temperature of water that must be neither too hot nor too cool, the exact blend of oils that carried the accumulated scent of her reign through myrrh from sacred temples and frankincense from distant mountains. Oil burning. Tonight, each familiar gesture carried the weight of finality that transformed routine into ceremony. The steam curled upward like incense in a temple, and she found herself studying it with the attention she once gave to diplomatic correspondence from Rome, breathing softly. How strange that water could hold such comfort when tomorrow would bring only stone and silence, when these same hands that arranged rose petals would soon be still. Footsteps echoing. Her fingers traced the surface of the perfumed water, creating ripples that caught the dying light like liquid gold, each circle expanding outward until it touched the marble edges and disappeared. Water drops. The rose petals drifted across the surface like fallen prayers, each one a small beauty that would fade before dawn brought Roman efficiency to Egyptian shores. Wind blowing. Beyond these chambers, Alexandria continued its ancient rhythms with unconscious persistence. Merchants closing their stalls after profitable days, fishermen preparing nets for dawn expeditions, children being called to evening meals by mothers who did not yet understand how completely their world had changed during the hours of darkness. Bells ringing. The city that had known pharaohs for 3 centuries would wake tomorrow to find itself orphaned, though perhaps only she truly understood what that orphaning would mean for the people who had never lived under foreign rule. Jewelry chiming. Iris arranged the golden ornaments with the same reverence she had shown for 20 years of devoted service, though tonight each piece seemed to weigh more than memory should allow any physical object to carry. Fabric rustling. The earrings that had witnessed the private meeting with Caesar, when alliance and attraction had seemed equally matched, the bracelet Antony had clasped around her wrist during their first feast in Alexandria. Each treasure carried ghosts of touched skin and whispered promises that had shaped the destiny of empires. Breathing softly, she lifted the ceremonial dress from its cedar chest with both hands, the silk so fine it seemed woven from captured moonlight and ancient dreams of royal splendor. Doors opening. Her hands knew every fold through years of practice, every place where the fabric caught light to create the illusion of divine radiance, every way the garment transformed mortal woman into immortal symbol of pharaonic authority. Footsteps echoing. Tonight it would perform this transformation alchemy for the final time, and Iris understood that she dressed not just a queen, but the last living connection to 3,000 years of unbroken royal tradition. Jewelry chiming. How does one prepare a ruler for her appointment with eternity? She had attended Cleopatra through diplomatic triumphs and personal sorrows, through the births of children whose royal blood made them targets rather than treasures, through the deaths of lovers whose political ambitions had exceeded their military capabilities. Oil burning. This final preparation demanded skills that went beyond the simple arts of cosmetics and jewelry, beyond the transformation techniques that made mortal flesh worthy of divine authority. Fabric rustling. She moved between the polished bronze mirrors and ivory cosmetic tables like a priestess, conducting an ancient rite that connected present ceremony to eternal purposes, served by beauty that transcended mere physical appearance. Breathing softly. The collar of Ra caught the lamplight with supernatural intensity, each golden sun disk reflecting flames that seemed to burn with the divine fire that had blessed Egyptian rulers since the first Pharaoh claimed connection between earthly authority and celestial power. Jewelry chiming. Iris lifted it with both hands, feeling the accumulated weight of 6 centuries of pharaonic authority concentrated in worked gold that had been blessed by priests who understood the sacred mathematics that governed relationships between mortal rulers and immortal gods. Wind blowing. This was not merely jewelry designed to ornament royal flesh. This was the physical manifestation of divine kingship, the golden bridge between earth and sky that allowed human beings to serve as vessels for goddess energy that could not be conquered by any earthly force. Fabric rustling. The ceremonial dress settled around Cleopatra's shoulders like water finding its perfect level, each fold arranged with the care that transformed simple clothing into royal regalia. Footsteps echoing. When the last ornament was placed with ceremonial precision, the last fold arranged according to traditions that predated Roman civilization, Iris stepped back to observe her work with the satisfaction that comes from service, perfectly rendered. Oil burning. In the lamplight that flickered like sacred flames, Cleopatra appeared not as a woman facing impossible political circumstances, but as a pharaoh prepared for the ceremonial journey that would carry her from mortality into the realm of myth, where true queens lived forever. Pages turning. The reed pen felt familiar between her fingers as Cleopatra settled at her writing desk, though tonight she would craft words that would never travel beyond these palace walls, letters to men whose bodies had long since returned to dust, but whose love had somehow outlived their breathing. Oil burning. The lamp cast steady light across papyrus that had been prepared according to ancient Egyptian techniques, each sheet representing the continuation of traditions that connected written words to sacred power through materials blessed by priests who understood the divine mathematics of preserved communication. Breathing softly. "My dearest Caesar," she began, then paused to consider what truths could be shared with the dead that the living had not already learned through bitter experience. Pages turning. The ink flowed smoothly from reed to papyrus as she told him about the library where scholars still debated his military commentaries, about the harbor he had admired during his first morning in Alexandria, about the administrative reforms he had suggested that might have prevented this final crisis if circumstances had permitted their implementation. Wind blowing. She described the Egypt he had never fully understood, not the exotic fantasy that Romans imagined, but the complex civilization that had survived Persian conquest and Greek occupation through the simple persistence of people who understood that cultural identity transcended political arrangements. Pages turning. Her words carried the weight of explaining 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition to a man whose own Roman traditions had shaped him to think strategically about emotional relationships, to calculate the political utility of personal affection, footsteps echoing. A fresh sheet of papyrus received Antony's letter, and here the words flowed more easily because she wrote to a man who had experienced Egyptian luxury without trying to rationalize it, who had understood that sometimes passion mattered more than practical considerations. Breathing softly, she told him about their children, how Helios had inherited his grandfather's gift for languages and his father's generous nature, how Selene possessed the particular intelligence that came from growing up bilingual in a world where survival required understanding multiple cultural perspectives simultaneously. Oil burning. The correspondence revealed the arc of two relationships that had defined her adult life through their different approaches to love within the dangerous context of imperial politics. Pages turning. Caesar had offered the attraction of intellectual equality, strategic partnership with a man whose mind could appreciate Egyptian sophistication while calculating its usefulness to Roman purposes. Antony had provided the intoxication of being adored without reservation, loved without the constant evaluation that characterized relationships between people who wielded authority over vast territories and diverse populations. Wind blowing. Through the window came the eternal sounds of Alexandria's harbor, waves against stone, ropes creaking in the night breeze, the distant voices of watchmen maintaining their posts while the Mediterranean carried Roman efficiency toward Egyptian shores. Breathing softly. The same waters that had brought Caesar's galleys and Antony's war fleet now delivered the imperial administration that would reorganize everything according to principles that valued uniformity over the cultural diversity that had made Alexandria the intellectual center of the civilized world. Pages turning. As she completed both letters, Cleopatra understood that she had achieved final communion with loves that death had not diminished, affections that had survived the men who felt them and would now accompany her into whatever realm awaited departed pharaohs. Footsteps echoing. These words would serve as bridges between mortal love and eternal memory, proving that some connections transcended the political circumstances that had made them impossible to sustain within the constraints of earthly existence. Water drops. Each pathway through these palace gardens held conversations Cleopatra could almost hear echoing across the years, diplomatic whispers conducted under olive trees during Caesar's visit, children's laughter by the lily pools when her own royal offspring had discovered the eternal joy of play, the rustle of silk as courtiers debated philosophy, while jasmine perfumed their sophisticated arguments about governance and beauty, wind blowing. Tonight, the garden remembered everything while she walked among shadows that had once been dreams of architectural perfection made manifest through Egyptian craftsmanship and royal vision. Footsteps echoing. She had designed these terraces herself during the optimistic years of her reign, choosing each flowering vine for its symbolic significance, positioning each marble bench to catch morning light or afternoon shade according to the complex calculations that transformed landscape into living art. Breathing softly. The cypress trees she had planted as a young queen now stood tall enough to provide secrets and shade for conversations she would never overhear, their roots drawing sustenance from Egyptian soil that would soon serve Roman purposes instead of pharaonic dreams. Oil burning. The fountain at the garden's heart splashed quietly, its carved dolphins sporting in perpetual joy that remained unchanged by human political arrangements, their stone forms capturing the essence of creatures that belonged entirely to the Mediterranean, rather than to any particular empire that claimed sovereignty over its shores. Water drops. Caesar had stood beside this fountain on his first morning in Alexandria, running his fingers through the moving water while asking pointed questions about Egyptian taxation methods, his practical Roman mind calculating the potential revenue that such luxury represented to imperial treasury officials. Wind blowing. The date palms whispered in the evening breeze, their fronds creating shadows that danced across paths worn smooth by 22 years of royal feet, walking in contemplation, in celebration, in the various. Apollodorus stood at his post with the precision that 15 years of military service had made automatic, though tonight his vigil carried emotional weights that no tactical training had prepared him to bear with grace. The corridor stretched before him like a symbolic bridge between two different worlds. Behind lay the Egypt he had sworn to protect with his life. Ahead waited an uncertain future where such oaths would carry no legal meaning under Roman military jurisdiction. His men maintained their positions throughout the palace with the silent coordination that came from years of shared duty, each guard understanding without words that tonight their responsibility had evolved beyond simple protection into something approaching religious witness. They were no longer merely protecting a queen's sleep, but maintaining vigil over the end of a story that had begun when the first Pharaoh claimed divine authority, when God still walked among mortals and the Nile flowed backward to honor royal commands. The bronze-tipped spear in his hands felt heavier tonight, despite the fact that its weight remained exactly what it had been yesterday, though its sharp point gleamed with the same deadly efficiency that had characterized the day of its forging. How many times had he polished this weapon while listening to Cleopatra's voice drift through these stone walls as she conducted the complex business of empire in 6 different languages, making decisions that moved armies across continents and altered the balance of power from Britain to Ethiopia. The leather straps of his armor had settled against shoulders that had carried this equipment through military campaigns in Upper Egypt, through diplomatic missions to Athens where Egyptian interests required representation in Greek councils, through ceremonial occasions when Alexandria had displayed its accumulated wealth to visiting dignitaries who left impressed by Egyptian sophistication and slightly intimidated by royal authority that seemed to possess supernatural dimensions. Tomorrow Roman centurions would wear different armor through these same corridors, their hobnailed sandals marking time according to imperial rhythms that acknowledged no continuity with pharaonic traditions. Beyond the palace windows, Alexandria settled into its evening routines, but the familiar sounds carried different undertones tonight, subdued conversations rather than confident laughter, the kind of expectant quiet that preceded earthquakes or other natural disasters that reorganized familiar landscapes according to forces too large for human resistance. The harbor had filled with Roman vessels whose foreign silhouettes broke the visual patterns that Egyptian fishing boats and merchant galleys had maintained for 3 centuries of independent trade. His second in command approached with the silent steps that made long watches bearable, offering wine and quiet conversation that acknowledged shared understanding without requiring explicit discussion of emotions that military discipline preferred to leave unexpressed. They drank together in companionable silence, 2 soldiers who had learned that loyalty sometimes meant standing witness to endings rather than fighting to prevent outcomes that had been determined by forces larger than individual courage or tactical skill. The night bells from Isis's temple reached them through walls of stone, calling the faithful to evening prayers with bronze voices that had maintained the same schedule since the temple's consecration during the reign of the first Ptolemy. Apollodorus found profound comfort in those ancient sounds. Some things would persist beyond political changes. Some spiritual rhythms ran deeper than imperial ambitions. Some forms of devotion would find ways to continue regardless of which mortals claimed temporary authority over provisional governmental arrangements. Helena's hands moved with the precision that 30 years in royal service had made instinctive, but tonight each cut of her knife carried ceremonial weight that transformed ordinary meal preparation into something approaching sacramental offering. The lamb for the queen's final feast simmered in wine that had been aged in Egyptian cellars, seasoned with herbs that grew in palace gardens, prepared according to recipes that had been refined through generations of royal banquets, designed to demonstrate that Egyptian hospitality could transform diplomatic necessity into genuine pleasure. She selected spices with the reverence of a priestess choosing sacred offerings, cinnamon bark from distant Ceylon that had traveled ancient trade routes to reach Egyptian kitchens, saffron threads from Persian mountains that cost more than gold, black pepper that represented the wealth of Asian commerce flowing through Alexandria's harbor toward Mediterranean markets. Each aromatic addition carried the memory of empire, the taste of a world that had acknowledged Egypt's central place in the civilized conversation between diverse cultures that shared the inland sea. The kitchen fires burned with unusual intensity tonight, casting dancing shadows across copper vessels that reflected decades of feast preparations for diplomatic celebrations, religious ceremonies, private dinners when royal authority had seemed securely established and the future had appeared manageable through careful planning. Her assistants worked around her with unusual reverence, understanding without explicit instruction that this meal demanded their finest skills, their most careful attention to details that would honor both the cook who prepared them and the queen who would receive them. The bread rose in ovens that had been heated with wood from sacred groves, the dough mixed with water from the well that provided the palace with liquid that had been blessed by priests who understood the spiritual significance of nourishment that connected physical sustenance to divine purpose. This was not merely food, but communion, not simple nourishment, but the final expression of Egyptian hospitality offered to a pharaoh who had devoted her adult life to maintaining the cultural traditions that made such culinary artistry possible. Helena had overseen the preparation of wedding feasts for royal children, funeral banquets that honored departed courtiers, diplomatic dinners that sealed alliance agreements with foreign rulers who left Alexandria impressed by Egyptian sophistication and convinced that partnership with such a civilization would enhance their own cultural status. Tonight's meal would surpass them all in symbolic importance if not in scale, representing the culmination of 3 decades spent learning to transform raw ingredients into expressions of love made visible through careful preparation. The kitchen filled with aromas that had defined royal dining throughout her career. Roasted lamb perfumed with spices that had been ground according to formulas passed down through generations of palace cooks, bread warm enough to melt honey that had been gathered from hives maintained in the royal gardens, wine that carried the essence of Egyptian soil in every drop. Tomorrow would bring Roman tastes and Roman preferences, imperial cuisine that emphasized efficiency over the patient artistry that made meals into ceremonies of cultural continuity. As the final preparations neared completion, Helena stepped back to survey her work with the deep satisfaction that came from service perfectly rendered, from skills applied with love to purposes that transcended immediate nourishment. The serving dishes waited like altar offerings, each one representing not just a cook's professional competence, but a final gift to the ruler who had made such culinary excellence possible through her patronage of the ancient arts that transformed necessity into beauty, survival into civilization. The palace children had gathered in their favorite courtyard for evening games, though tonight their play carried undertones of confusion as young minds processed adult conversations they had overheard without fully understanding the implications for their own immediate futures. They knew something had changed in the familiar rhythms of palace life. Servants spoke in hushed tones, guards stood straighter at their posts. The comfortable routines that had defined their small world seemed somehow more fragile than they had been just yesterday morning. The fountain at the courtyard's center continued its eternal splash, providing both music and mischief as it had for every generation of palace children, who had discovered the universal joy of disrupting careful water patterns with small hands that delighted in creating ripples. Today the children took turns dipping fingers in water that caught the last light like liquid gold, creating circles that expanded outward until they touched marble edges and disappeared, each temporary disturbance quickly absorbed back into the fountain's peaceful constancy. Young Miriam arranged her painted wooden doll's tiny garments with the same serious concentration that court ladies brought to royal robes, whispering stories to the carved face about princesses and magical birds that bore no resemblance to the grim political realities being discussed in the palace's formal chambers. Her doll would be queen of imaginary kingdoms where problems could be solved through kindness, and everyone important got to wear beautiful clothes that never became soiled during the practical business of governing actual territories with real human complications. Kayimwaset chased shadows between the marble columns with the boundless energy that characterized boys who had not yet learned that physical exuberance must sometimes be constrained by social circumstances beyond their control. He had heard adults speaking in worried whispers about ships and soldiers, but worry was an adult emotion that had no place in games that required complete attention to the immediate joy of movement and the simple pleasure of being young enough to believe that play mattered more than politics. The afternoon bells from various temples provided soundtrack for their games, bronze voices calling across the city in the same patterns that had marked time for generations of Egyptian children who had learned to count hours by religious observances rather than by the mechanical devices that Romans preferred for measuring temporal progression. Some rhythms persisted beyond political change. Some patterns provided stability that transcended governmental transitions. As evening approached and shadows grew longer across ancient stones, the children's voices grew softer, but their games continued with the unconscious persistence that characterized young people who lived entirely in present moments rather than worrying about uncertain futures. Their caretakers began appearing at the courtyard's edges, calling gently for small bodies that needed washing and feeding before bed, though they spoke with unusual tenderness that attempted to provide extra comfort without explaining why such comfort might be necessary. The children gathered their simple toys with the universal reluctance of youth facing the end of play, but they obeyed because tomorrow seemed likely to bring new games, new arguments about rules, new opportunities to transform ordinary spaces into kingdoms where imagination ruled and joy required no justification beyond its own existence. As the courtyard emptied of young voices, it settled into peaceful quiet that would dream of children's laughter until dawn brought whatever changes the adult world had prepared for those too young to participate in the complex negotiations that determined the fate of empires and the people who lived within their provisional boundaries. Demetrius had devoted 23 years to recording the deeds of pharaohs in scripts that connected written words to sacred power, but tonight his reed stylus carved entries that would serve as the final chapter in a historical chronicle that had been 3,000 years in the telling. The lamp cast steady illumination across papyrus that bore the concluding documentation of divine kingship in Egypt, the last official records of pharaonic authority that would soon become historical curiosities rather than active governmental documents. The challenge of writing civilization's end required choosing words carefully, selecting language that would convey the dignity of royal decisions without revealing the desperation that political circumstances had made inevitable. Each sentence carried the weight of representing not just current events, but the culmination of cultural traditions that had produced architectural marvels, artistic masterpieces, philosophical innovations that had enriched human civilization for longer than any other continuous governmental system in recorded history. How does one document the transformation of living authority into historical memory? The ink had been mixed according to formulas older than Rome itself, using pigments that had colored the chronicles of Thutmose and Hatshepsut, Akhenaten and Ramesses, all the royal names that represented humanity's longest experiment in organizing society around the principle that mortal rulers could serve as intermediaries between earthly necessity and divine purpose. The same materials that had recorded the building of pyramids now documented their symbolic demolition. The same techniques that had preserved royal victories now chronicled the circumstances that had made further resistance impossible. The royal seal pressed into warm wax for what would be the final time, leaving the cartouche of divine kingship impressed in red that would harden like dried blood, creating the last official mark of pharaonic authority on documents that tomorrow would be studied by Roman clerks who could read ancient Greek but would never understand the spiritual context that gave such records meaning beyond simple administrative function. These scrolls represented more than governmental paperwork. They were the death certificate of a civilization that had survived Persian conquest and Greek occupation but could not accommodate Roman efficiency. He documented the Queen's final decrees with the precision that had made him valuable to a monarch who understood that accurate record-keeping outlasted architectural monuments in preserving the memory of how divine authority had actually functioned in a world that operated according to practical considerations rather than theoretical perfection. Each law she had issued during these final hours was recorded with complete legal language, each gift to loyal servants noted with recipient names and exact values, ensuring that history would understand how a pharaoh faced ending with the same attention to detail that had characterized her approach to governance throughout 22 years of rule. The chronicles that stretched back through dynasties would be concluded tonight by entries that maintained the same literary standards, the same commitment to truth, the same respect for the complexity of human motivation that had made Egyptian record-keeping the most reliable source of historical information about ancient Mediterranean civilization. Tomorrow, Roman scribes would begin new records in Latin, reducing Egypt to provincial status in documents that emphasized administrative efficiency over the cultural continuity that had made such detailed chronicles possible in the first place. As he completed the final entry with careful calligraphy that honored both the importance of the events being recorded and the literary traditions that had shaped 3 millennia of royal documentation, Demetrius understood that he had served as witness to the end of humanity's longest governmental experiment, the conclusion of a story that had provided stability and continuity through more historical changes than any other political system had ever successfully navigated until tonight. Each crystal vial in Cleopatra's perfume chamber contained more than mere fragrance. They held the distilled essence of seasons from her reign, memories crystallized in oils that could summon specific moments with the precision of trained musicians, striking exact notes to recreate complex emotional harmonies. Tonight, she moved among them like a priestess conducting her final ceremony, selecting scents that would carry her into whatever eternity awaited Egyptian queens who had loved unwisely but ruled as wisely as political circumstances had permitted. The ivory containers lined marble shelves in careful order that reflected not just aesthetic preference, but the chronological progression of her adult life, each fragrance marking significant events that had shaped both personal experience and imperial policy. The myrrh from her coronation day still carried the solemn weight of 17-year-old shoulders, accepting divine authority, while the frankincense from diplomatic ceremonies retained the memory of foreign ambassadors kneeling before the Pharaoh's throne in acknowledgement of Egyptian power that had seemed permanently established. She lifted the crystal stopper from rose oil that had scented her skin during the night Caesar first shared her bed, when political alliance and personal attraction had seemed like compatible forces rather than competing demands on human loyalty. The scent carried echoes of possibility, the memory of believing that intelligence and beauty could reshape Roman imperial policy, that an Egyptian queen might yet teach conquering Rome the difference between territorial acquisition and cultural partnership. The jasmine oil spoke of evenings in the palace gardens when royal children had chased butterflies between flowering vines, when motherhood had provided respite from the constant calculations required by ruling an independent kingdom surrounded by expanding Roman authority. Caesarion had loved jasmine above all other flowers. She had worn this particular fragrance often during his childhood, until the scent had become inseparable from maternal tenderness and the quiet moments when pharaohs became simply mothers worried about their children's happiness rather than their political utility. The cedar essence brought back Antony's presence so powerfully that she almost turned toward the doorway, expecting to see him lounging against marble columns with that particular smile that had meant he was planning either magnificent generosity or spectacular indulgence in pleasures that made Roman politicians uncomfortable. They had been excessive together in every emotion, turning love into public theater while maintaining private sanctuary, creating a relationship that had served as both diplomatic alliance and genuine affection until military defeat had made such luxurious emotional expression impossible to sustain. For tonight's final hours, she chose the simplest option, pure frankincense that connected mortal flesh to divine purpose, the sacred scent that had been used in Egyptian temples since before human memory began recording religious practices. This fragrance emphasized spiritual rather than sensual dimensions of royal authority, eternal rather than temporal aspects of pharaonic responsibility that would persist beyond the reach of Roman administrative reorganization. As she applied the consecrated oil to pulse points where life announced itself most clearly through the rhythm of blood carrying divine breath throughout mortal flesh, Cleopatra understood that she had chosen not just personal fragrance, but ceremonial preparation for the transformation that would carry her from earthly queenship into the realm of myth, where true pharaohs achieved the immortality that political power could never provide. Tonight, her final perfume would be the simple scent of divine protection rather than earthly pleasure, connecting her to the goddess who had blessed Egypt since before memory began counting years. Keti moved among the sacred serpents with reverence that had been inherited through 7 generations of temple service, though tonight his priestly duties carried spiritual weights that no traditional training had prepared him to bear with the detachment that religious obligation normally required. The asps stirred in their ceremonial baskets with movements that seemed to acknowledge the approaching fulfillment of their ancient purpose, sensing perhaps that their carefully maintained existence was about to serve the ultimate function for which generations of temple keepers had prepared them through patient devotion to creatures that embodied divine will. The temple chamber filled with myrrh smoke that had sanctified these rituals since the first Pharaoh had learned that divine kingship sometimes required divine departure when earthly circumstances made continued rule incompatible with royal honor. Keti breathed the perfumed air while checking each serpent with hands that had learned to touch death without fear, to serve endings as reverently as beginnings, to understand that some forms of ministry required facilitating transformation rather than preserving existing conditions. The stone walls bore hieroglyphs that told the complete story of royal transformation. Pharaohs becoming stars in eternal constellations, queens joining the goddess Isis in celestial splendor, divine rulers exchanging earthly crowns for cosmic authority that acknowledged no temporal limitations. Tonight, these ancient texts would cease being symbolic instruction and become practical guidance, their metaphorical language translated into physical ceremony that would honor traditions older than any foreign occupation. The largest asp, sacred to Isis herself, trained according to temple mysteries that connected serpent wisdom to goddess knowledge, fed on offerings that had been blessed by royal hands during ceremonies that maintained the bond between mortal authority and divine purpose, lifted its triangular head with dignity that befitted a creature chosen by gods to serve as bridge between temporal existence and eternal consciousness. Keti had cared for this particular serpent since its birth, knowing always that their relationship served purposes larger than simple animal husbandry, deeper than mere temple maintenance. He arranged traditional offerings around the basket, with movements that had been perfected through decades of religious practice, bread baked with grain that had been consecrated in Isis's temple, wine that had been blessed according to formulas that connected liquid offering to divine acceptance, flowers that bloomed only in sacred precincts where goddess presence maintained conditions necessary for such specialized beauty. These serpents represented living prayers, creatures whose very existence demonstrated divine provision for pharaohs who found themselves choosing between earthly survival and royal dignity. The temple texts spoke with absolute clarity about royal departure when political mathematics eliminated all alternatives that preserved both life and honor. The gods had provided these options that maintained spiritual continuity while acknowledging temporal defeat, these ceremonial possibilities that honored both Egyptian traditions and human limitations. Tonight, ancient wisdom would demonstrate its practical value through creatures that had been born for sacred service, raised for divine honor, prepared through years of careful tending for the single moment when symbolic duty became literal ministry. As he lifted the ceremonial basket with both hands, feeling the serpent's weight shift as it adjusted to movement with the patience that characterized creatures trained for religious purposes, Keti understood that he carried not just a temple animal, but the physical embodiment of goddess mercy, the living proof that even endings could be beautiful when they served purposes larger than individual preference, deeper than political calculation. Some ministry required providing alternatives when circumstances eliminated all choices except those that demanded abandoning everything that made existence meaningful. And tonight he would fulfill the highest religious service by enabling dignity where dignity had seemed impossible. The burial instructions required perfection in every detail, each specification written with the precision that had characterized Cleopatra's approach to governance throughout 22 years of rule over territories that stretched from the Mediterranean to the cataracts of the Nile. She wrote for people she would never meet, in times she could not imagine, leaving directions for ceremonies that would need to serve simultaneously as royal funeral and historical statement about the persistence of Egyptian traditions under any political circumstances. The arrangements filled scroll after scroll with specifications that seemed designed to control time itself, ensuring that even death would honor the cultural continuity that had sustained pharaonic authority through 3 millennia of challenges from foreign invaders, domestic rebellions, and the various natural disasters that had tested Egyptian resilience without ever completely destroying the spiritual foundations that made such persistence possible. The body shall be wrapped in linen spun from flax, grown in the sacred fields, she wrote, connecting her eternal rest to Egyptian soil that had nurtured 40 dynasties of divine rulers. Each completed scroll was sealed with wax that bore her royal cartouche, the symbolic representation of pharaonic authority that would soon lose all earthly meaning, but might yet carry spiritual power in whatever realm awaited departed queens who had chosen honor over survival. These documents represented final exercises of royal command over subjects she would never see obeying them, last demonstrations of authority over circumstances she would not survive to witness, proving that effective leadership sometimes required planning beyond the planner's own existence. The tomb goods demanded their own careful inventory, which ornaments should accompany her spiritual journey, which scrolls should provide reading material in whatever libraries existed beyond mortal reach, which servants should be honored by inclusion in ceremonies that would establish their eternal status as companions to divine authority. She chose not the most financially valuable objects, but the most emotionally significant ones, items that held memories rather than simple wealth, treasures that connected personal experience to royal responsibility. The Uraeus serpent of gold and lapis lazuli she wrote with particular care, fashioned during the reign of my ancestor Ptolemy II, worn by 11 queens before myself, blessed by priests who understood the sacred mathematics that connected earthly ornament to celestial authority. Each piece of burial jewelry would tell part of the dynasty's story, ensuring that her tomb would preserve not just individual memory, but 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule that had attempted to balance Egyptian independence with Mediterranean political reality. The religious instructions required specification in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that connected written preservation to divine power through scripts that had been sacred since the first scribes learned to capture spoken prayer in visual symbols. She wrote invocations to Isis, appeals to Osiris, protective spells that would ensure safe passage through whatever underworld geography awaited souls who had wielded earthly authority over territories that gods had blessed with the Nile's annual miracle. The practical arrangements demanded equal attention to details that would protect her eternal rest from both Roman curiosity and common thieves, ensuring that tomb security would honor pharaonic dignity while acknowledging the political realities that would govern Egypt under imperial administration. Even in death, divine kingship required protection, spiritual authority needed physical security, eternal rest demanded temporal arrangements that would persist beyond the governmental transition that had made such elaborate planning necessary. As the final scroll filled with her careful instructions, Cleopatra experienced the strange satisfaction that came from completing impossible tasks through patient attention to practical details, from transforming emotional necessity into administrative achievement, from ensuring that her ending would serve Egyptian purposes, regardless of which foreign authority would claim responsibility for implementing arrangements that honored traditions they could never fully understand. Venus appeared in the twilight sky with the same punctual brilliance that had marked every evening since before human civilization began organizing itself around the illusion that mortal institutions could achieve permanent significance through territorial conquest or cultural achievement. Cleopatra watched the evening star rise from her private balcony, understanding that some celestial patterns provided perspective that reduced individual catastrophes to brief interruptions in cosmic rhythms that acknowledged no human authority as ultimate or eternal. The Mediterranean stretched toward horizons that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, waters that had carried Phoenician traders and Greek philosophers, Roman legions and Egyptian grain ships, all the various human enterprises that had attempted to transform geography into political possession, despite the sea's fundamental indifference to imperial claims. Tonight, those same waters reflected starlight that had illuminated Egyptian queens and Roman emperors, Babylonian astronomers and Persian mystics, providing the same neutral illumination for all human attempts to create meaning from mortality. The evening breeze stirred silk hangings that would tomorrow be replaced by Roman textiles, but wind itself acknowledged no governmental authority, served no imperial purpose, continued its ancient work of connecting all places and all peoples through the simple democracy of shared air that made breathing possible regardless of political affiliation. Some forces remained permanently neutral in human conflicts, indifferent to the various claims of cultural superiority that motivated territorial expansion, diplomatic negotiation, the complex calculations that made some nations attempt to dominate others through military efficiency. The first stars appeared in patterns that Egyptian priests had studied for millennia, constellations that had guided agricultural planning and religious ceremonies since civilization began along the Nile's banks, their positions unchanged by the human tendency to rename celestial objects according to different mythological systems. Roman astronomers would use different names for the same stellar configurations, but stars themselves continued their eternal dance, regardless of which languages attempted to capture cosmic relationships in temporarily meaningful words. From the city below came mixed sounds of Egyptian and Roman voices, learning to coexist through the inevitable negotiations between occupier and occupied that would establish new patterns of daily life under changed governmental circumstances. Yet beneath these immediate adjustments lay deeper rhythms that had characterized Alexandria since its foundation: harbor commerce and marketplace exchange, temple worship and scholarly debate, the human activities that persisted under any political system because they served needs more fundamental than territorial allegiance. The goddess Isis had appeared as Venus in Greek astronomical tradition, demonstrating how divine presence adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining essential identity that transcended particular religious practices or specific governmental arrangements. Tonight, The evening star would witness the final ceremonies of pharaonic rule while preparing to illuminate whatever new forms of civilization would emerge from the creative tension between Egyptian cultural traditions and Roman administrative innovation. As full darkness settled over Alexandria with the patient inevitability that characterized all natural transitions, the evening star reached its brightest intensity, outshining surrounding celestial objects with steady radiance that had made it a symbol of constancy across multiple civilizations that had attempted to organize human society according to various principles of justice, efficiency, or simple survival. Cleopatra found profound comfort in this cosmic reliability, this nightly reminder that some forms of beauty persisted beyond the reach of imperial ambition. Some sources of light continued burning regardless of which mortals claimed temporary authority over provisional political arrangements. The star that Greeks had called Aphrodite and Romans would rename Venus carried the same divine presence under any designation, provided the same reliable illumination for navigation, the same inspiration for lovers who looked skyward, seeking signs that their personal feelings participated in patterns larger than individual experience, more permanent than earthly government. The watchtower had been Marcus's world for 3 months, ever since the Queen had ordered constant surveillance for Roman sails on the horizon that had remained empty until this dawn transformed distant shapes into immediate reality. Now those dark silhouettes against the morning light made every previous sunrise seem like borrowed time, each peaceful day a gift that political mathematics had finally decided to recall. His hands gripped the stone parapet as he counted the approaching vessels with military precision. Too many to be merchants conducting normal business, too organized to be pirates seeking opportunistic raids, too purposeful to be anything except Octavian's long-promised fleet arriving to collect the Egyptian tribute that diplomacy had failed to negotiate. The Mediterranean wind that had once brought favorable news from Roman allies now carried the scent of imperial efficiency, the particular mixture of leather and bronze that announced the arrival of professional soldiers conducting official business. The morning bells from Isis's temple reached him across the awakening city, their bronze voices unchanged by the political mathematics that had made this dawn inevitable for anyone who understood the trajectory of events since Actium's naval disaster. Marcus wondered if the priests knew they called the faithful to prayers that might be their last in a free Alexandria, if the goddess who had protected Egypt since before memory would find new ways to express her ancient power under Roman religious administration. The signal flags hung ready beside him, red for immediate danger, white for uncertain threat, green for safety that would never return to Egyptian shores. This morning demanded colors that had never been created, symbols for situations that military training had never addressed directly. How does one signal the end of everything that had seemed permanent? Below, the port began its daily awakening with unconscious routine, fishing boats preparing for morning catches that would be sold in markets now subject to Roman taxation, merchant vessels checking cargo that would flow through trade routes reorganized according to imperial priorities, dock workers gathering around fires that warmed hands against dawn's chill while their employers calculated profit margins under changed governmental circumstances. None of them looked toward the horizon where their future approached with the methodical patience that made Roman conquests so dreadfully reliable in their completion. Marcus had served in Apollodorus's guard for 5 years, long enough to understand that loyalty sometimes meant carrying knowledge that felt too heavy for individual shoulders to bear alone. The captain had trained them all to observe clearly and report accurately. But how could mere words capture the emotional weight of watching an empire die from its tallest tower, of being first to witness the arrival of forces that would reorganize 3,000 years of Egyptian independence according to Roman administrative principles? He lit the morning signal fire, sending smoke into air that would soon carry different messages to different eyes serving different purposes. Tomorrow, Roman scouts would use this same tower to coordinate their occupation activities, transform this Egyptian watchtower into another piece of imperial machinery designed to process conquered territories with the efficient brutality that had built the largest empire in human history. As he prepared to descend with news that would transform possibility into certainty, Marcus held the loneliness of being first to see what everyone had dreaded, first to witness the moment when Egyptian independence became Egyptian memory. Marcus approached the queen's receiving chamber with steps that carried the accumulated weight of empire's ending, each footfall echoing against marble that had witnessed 3 centuries of royal audiences where Egyptian voices had shaped Mediterranean politics through diplomatic skill rather than military conquest. The morning air stirred through open windows as he prepared to transform distant shapes on water into immediate reality within palace walls that had sheltered pharaonic authority since Alexander's successors had established their capital in this chosen place. Cleopatra sat with the particular stillness that had characterized her approach to governance throughout 22 years of navigating the treacherous currents of Roman politics, composed, attentive, ready to receive whatever information the morning brought while maintaining the royal dignity that acknowledged no circumstance as impossible to face with grace. When she nodded for him to speak, Marcus understood that she had already guessed what words would follow, had perhaps been preparing for this exact moment since the day Actium's defeat had made Roman victory inevitable, rather than merely probable. "Ships, Majesty," he said, with the directness that military training had taught him to value over elaborate explanation that might obscure essential facts. "Octavian's fleet." Dawn revealed what darkness had hidden throughout the night. The words fell into silence that seemed to expand rather than break, filling the chamber with the weight of confirmed fears that political calculation had long suggested, but personal hope had continued to resist. Her fingers moved among the ornaments scattered across the cedar table, not nervous fidgeting, but the precise rearrangement that indicated a mind processing crucial information, while hands sought familiar comfort through contact with objects that had acquired meaning through years of use in similar moments of decision. Marcus had observed this gesture during other crises when private thought required physical anchor, when royal composure demanded some outlet for emotions that could not be publicly displayed without undermining the authority that effective leadership required. Through the windows came the sounds of Alexandria beginning another day, market vendors calling their wares in voices that had not yet learned to accommodate Roman customers, children playing in courtyards that would soon echo with foreign languages. The eternal conversation between harbor and city that had defined this place since its founding, but would now serve different masters according to different priorities. "How many vessels?" she asked, her tone carrying the same measured cadence she had used for questions about grain harvests or diplomatic schedules throughout her reign. Marcus provided the details his training had taught him to observe, Ship types that indicated military rather than commercial purpose, estimated numbers that suggested serious imperial commitment, the organized formation that spoke of professional planning rather than opportunistic raiding. As he spoke, Marcus watched the queen's face register each piece of information without revealing whether the news surprised her or merely confirmed what strategic thinking had already suggested about Octavian's intentions regarding Egyptian independence. She possessed the particular skill that characterized effective rulers, the ability to absorb unwelcome information without allowing emotional response to interfere with the clear thinking that crisis demanded from those responsible for other people's welfare. When his report reached its conclusion, she dismissed him with the same courtesy that had marked every interaction during his years of service, acknowledging his duty without betraying the weight of what he had announced. "Thank you, Marcus. Your clarity serves Egypt well," she said, words that carried no special emphasis, no acknowledgement that he had just delivered news that would transform her remaining hours from preparation into ceremony, from planning into the execution of plans that had been forming since Roman efficiency had proven superior to Egyptian elegance on Actium's waters. Charmian's hands moved through the familiar ritual of royal preparation with movements that had become meditation through 15 years of shared mornings, but today each gesture carried ceremonial weight that transformed ordinary grooming into something approaching sacred ceremony. She had attended Cleopatra through diplomatic victories and personal sorrows, through celebrations that had announced Egyptian prosperity to the Mediterranean world and private griefs that had tested royal composure beyond its normal limits. The morning light filtered through the chamber windows differently today, carrying undertones that suggested change approaching with the inevitability of natural forces that acknowledged no human authority as permanent or sufficient to alter their predetermined course. They worked together in the silence that had developed between them over years of preparing for public appearances that required transforming private woman into public symbol, mortal flesh into divine authority that could command respect from foreign ambassadors who represented rival powers. Neither spoke directly about the Roman ships that now commanded the harbor, both understanding that words would only diminish what their exchanged glances already communicated with perfect clarity about the approaching end of arrangements that had provided structure and meaning to their daily routines. This morning's preparation served purposes beyond simple royal appearance. It represented the final performance of rituals that had connected them to traditions that predated Roman civilization and would need to find new expressions under imperial governance. Charmian selected cosmetics with unusual care, understanding that today's application would be photographed by history rather than merely observed by courtiers conducting normal palace business. Each choice of pigment and powder carried significance that went beyond aesthetic preference to encompass the complex symbolism that made royal appearance into political statement about cultural continuity and personal dignity under any circumstances. The ritual garments held accumulated memory from dozens of state occasions when Egyptian sophistication had impressed foreign visitors who left Alexandria, convinced that partnership with such a civilization would enhance their own cultural status rather than merely provide access to Egyptian resources. Tonight, these same garments would transform a woman facing impossible political choices into a pharaoh prepared for whatever ceremony divine kingship might require when earthly authority reached its appointed limits. They moved with the coordination that came from years of shared purpose, each understanding her role in preparations that honored both the woman who would wear the results and the traditions that made such elaborate attention to royal appearance into expressions of cultural values that transcended immediate political circumstances. The transformation progressed with the patient precision that made mundane activities into art when performed with sufficient love and attention to details that mattered more for their symbolic significance than their practical utility. As the final adjustments were made to ornaments that had been positioned according to protocols that connected present ceremony to ancient authority, both women understood that they had participated in something larger than personal grooming. They had maintained continuity with practices that honored the sacred dimension of leadership, even when leadership itself faced circumstances that made its continuation impossible. Some preparations transcended their immediate purpose to become forms of prayer. Some service achieved the status of devotion through the simple gift of care offered without reservation or calculation of reward. When the transformation was complete, Charmian stepped back with the satisfaction that came from work performed with love, from skills applied to purposes that honored both the servant who provided them and the queen who received them as expressions of loyalty that would persist beyond any political change that might alter the external circumstances of their relationship. The council chamber held the accumulated wisdom of decisions that had reshaped the Mediterranean world through Egyptian initiative, but this morning Apollodorus and the remaining advisors gathered to discuss alternatives that everyone understood existed only in the realm of theoretical possibility rather than practical achievement. The maps spread across the cedar table showed escape routes that led toward territories where Roman authority had not yet established the administrative infrastructure that made pursuit inevitable, alliances with powers that had already declared their preference for Octavian's protection over Egyptian friendship. They spoke with the careful formality that had characterized these meetings throughout Cleopatra's reign, though today their words carried the ceremonial weight of ritual rather than the practical energy of genuine strategic planning. Each proposal was examined with thoroughness that honored the pretense that meaningful choice still existed, that royal will could still alter the trajectory of events that Roman efficiency had set in irreversible motion toward predetermined conclusions. The southern route through Nubia, suggested Demetrius, his finger tracing pathways on papyrus maps that depicted territories where Egyptian influence might still carry enough weight to provide temporary sanctuary from Roman administrative reorganization. His calculations were precise, his geographical knowledge comprehensive, his recommendations practical for circumstances that practical men understood could not be achieved through any available means. Apollodorus listened with the attention that duty demanded, while understanding that they planned for impossibilities that served dignity rather than utility. 15 years of military experience had taught him to distinguish between strategies that might succeed under favorable conditions and gestures that maintained honor during retreat from positions that could no longer be defended through conventional means. The treasurer reported on portable wealth with meticulous accuracy, gold that could be moved quickly if movement were possible, jewels that held value across cultural boundaries if boundaries could be crossed, resources that might fund exile if exile could be achieved without immediately triggering the efficient pursuit that characterized Roman responses to challenges against imperial authority. His accounting was flawless, his recommendations logical, his proposals entirely divorced from political reality that had eliminated all options except those that required choosing the manner rather than the fact of surrender. Through the windows came harbor sounds that now included Roman voices conducting the preliminary business of occupation with the methodical patience that made imperial administration so effective in processing conquered territories according to standardized procedures. The city that had been entirely Egyptian when their meeting began would be significantly Roman before their discussion ended, the pace of transformation accelerating beyond any possibility of control or meaningful resistance. The conversation continued through the morning, covering contingencies that could not occur, preparations for journeys that would never begin, arrangements for futures that Roman planning had already assigned to different purposes, according to imperial priorities that acknowledged no obligation to accommodate Egyptian preferences or traditions. Yet the meeting served its intended function, demonstrating that Egyptian wisdom persisted even when Egyptian power had reached its limits, that cultural dignity could be maintained even when political authority had been superseded by forces too large for individual influence to redirect. When the council finally concluded, each member understood that they had participated not in governmental process, but in ceremonial conclusion, not in strategy session, but in funeral rite for 3 centuries of independence that had attempted to balance Egyptian autonomy with Mediterranean political reality. They left to resume duties that had become forms of devotion, service that honored the past, rather than attempting to control a future that had been determined by mathematics too complex for resistance and too final for negotiation. The palace children had noticed changes in the familiar rhythms that governed their small world, though their young minds struggled to process adult conversations they had overheard without understanding the implications for their own immediate futures. They gathered their simple treasures with unusual care, sensing that routine disruption meant more than temporary inconvenience, but lacking the experience necessary to comprehend what permanent displacement might require from people too young to influence their own circumstances. Their caretakers spoke in voices that worked too hard to sound normal, bright tones that attempted to mask anxiety while providing instructions for preparations that served purposes the children could not yet understand. The packing proceeded with efficiency that emphasized practical necessity over emotional comfort, each family reduced to whatever portable possessions could be carried during journeys that might require walking great distances through territories where too many belongings would announce refugee status to observers who might report such information to Roman authorities. Young Mariam clutched her painted wooden doll while asking questions that revealed how quickly childhood adaptation confronted circumstances that adult wisdom struggled to explain gently. "Why can't we stay and play with the Roman children?" she asked, not understanding that Roman children would come with Roman families who served Roman purposes that had no place for Egyptian palace residents, whose loyalty to displaced pharaohs might complicate imperial administrative efficiency. The morning progressed with increasing urgency as departure schedules accommodated the reality that delay would only make travel more dangerous for families seeking sanctuary in places where Egyptian refugees might find temporary protection from the systematic reorganization that characterized Roman occupation of conquered territories. Each bundle loaded onto departing vehicles represented choices about which memories could be preserved in portable form and which attachments would need to be abandoned to circumstances beyond human control. Helena supervised the kitchen children's evacuation with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly as she made decisions about which families could stay together and which separations served the greater goal of ensuring that at least some palace children would survive to carry Egyptian memories into whatever futures awaited them beyond Roman administrative reach. 30 years of palace service had not prepared her for the mathematics of survival that required choosing between competing loyalties, between immediate safety and long-term cultural continuity. The palace that had provided security and identity for these young lives was transforming into a place where their presence would become political liability rather than innocent decoration, where Roman efficiency would view Egyptian children as potential problems requiring solutions that emphasized administrative convenience over human welfare. Tomorrow would bring different voices, speaking different languages, in courtyards where Egyptian children had learned to walk and discovered the universal joy of games that transcended political circumstances. The final departures carried emotional weight that made necessary separations feel like small deaths. Temporary arrangements that everyone hoped would prove temporary, but that practical wisdom suggested might extend far beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. As the last cart disappeared beyond the palace gates, carrying children who had never known any home except these walls toward uncertain destinations that might or might not provide the safety that love demanded, the courtyards settled into silence that would persist until Roman families discovered their potential for new forms of childhood that served different cultural purposes. Some games outlast empires, some laughter echoes longer than political arrangements. But today's evacuations acknowledged that protecting innocence sometimes required removing it from familiar places to unknown locations where it might continue growing according to different rules established by different authorities who served different gods through different ceremonies that honored different definitions of what childhood should become when it matured into adult responsibility. Nicomedes had devoted his entire career to calculating the wealth that 3 centuries of pharaonic rule had accumulated through careful stewardship, but this morning's inventory served purposes that transcended simple accounting to encompass the complex task of measuring civilization's material achievements. The treasury chamber contained objects that represented not just Egyptian prosperity, but the artistic vision that power could commission when authority served aesthetic purposes rather than merely strategic objectives. Each piece caught lamplight with intensity that revealed weights and purities that had been precisely recorded in ledgers that would soon become historical documents rather than active administrative tools. The scales balanced with mathematical precision, but bronze and arithmetic could never measure the true value of treasures that had been blessed by pharaohs, worn during ceremonies that connected earthly authority to divine purpose, used in diplomatic negotiations that had shaped Mediterranean politics for generations. The jewelry collection told stories that no monetary calculation could capture adequately. Earrings that had witnessed private conferences with Caesar when alliance and attraction had seemed like compatible forces, bracelets that had adorned royal arms during Antony's lavish celebrations, necklaces that had been worn during the births of children who carried the genetic heritage of 2 empires in their royal blood. Each piece would find its way into Roman collections where craftsmanship would be appreciated, while historical significance was reduced to curiosity rather than sacred memory. Nicomedes weighed pearls that had been diplomatic gifts from distant kings seeking Egyptian favor, counted coins that bore the cartouches of pharaohs whose reigns had established Egypt's reputation for cultural sophistication, measured precious stones that had been cut according to techniques that Egyptian craftsmen had perfected through centuries of royal patronage. Tomorrow, Roman appraisers would assign values based purely on material composition, transforming symbols of divine kingship into commodities that could be sold in markets where beauty mattered less than utility. His assistant treasurers worked beside him with unusual reverence, understanding that they documented not just royal wealth, but the physical manifestation of Egyptian artistic achievement that had made Alexandria the cultural center of the civilized world. Each recorded item represented choices made by rulers who understood that beautiful objects could carry cultural meaning across centuries, that investing in craftsmanship was investing in civilizational memory that would outlast political arrangements. The sacred vessels used in temple ceremonies posed particular challenges for financial evaluation. How could accounting capture the worth of objects that had been consecrated for divine service, that had held offerings to gods whose worship would be reorganized according to Roman religious policies that emphasized administrative efficiency over spiritual complexity? These pieces belonged in temples rather than treasuries, served prayer rather than economic calculation, but Roman practicality would measure their value in gold rather than understanding their significance in connecting mortal worship to divine presence. As the morning progressed, the inventory expanded into a document that would guide Roman distribution of wealth that had been gathered to serve Egyptian cultural purposes, ensure that treasures blessed by pharaohs would ornament Roman celebrations that honored different gods through ceremonies that acknowledged no continuity with 3,000-year-old traditions. Each entry represented not just material acquisition, but the bureaucratic dissolution of institutions that had maintained relationships with Egypt's most ancient spiritual practices. When the last item had been weighed and recorded with precision, that honored both the object's material composition and the record-keeping traditions that had made Egyptian administration the most reliable source of historical information about ancient Mediterranean commerce, Nicomedes understood that he had created the death certificate for economic independence that had funded cultural achievements that would be remembered long after their political context had been forgotten by scholars who studied artifacts without understanding the human purposes they had served. The sacred flames burned with devotional constancy that had characterized their service since the temple's consecration during the reign of the first Ptolemy, unchanged by Roman ships that now commanded Alexandria's harbor with imperial authority. The Isis priestess moved through evening rituals with practiced reverence that connected present worship to spiritual traditions that had protected Egypt since before human memory began counting dynasties, since before civilization had learned to organize itself around the principle that mortal rulers could serve as intermediaries between earthly necessity and divine purpose. The invocations came in ancient Egyptian, words that linked contemporary devotion to the very foundation of pharaonic spirituality through linguistic continuity that had survived Persian conquest and Greek occupation without losing essential connection to goddess presence that transcended political arrangements. Incense carried these appeals toward divine attention that had blessed the Nile's flooding, guided royal decisions, protected Egyptian independence through 20 dynasties of foreign pressure that had tested but never completely destroyed the spiritual foundations that made cultural persistence possible. The sacred pool reflected flames that traced their lineage to fires that had been kindled during temple dedication ceremonies, attended by pharaohs whose names were carved in hieroglyphs on walls that would soon echo with Latin prayers serving Roman religious administration. The priestess dipped consecrated fingers in water that had been blessed according to formulas that predated any foreign influence, liquid offering that connected present ceremony to divine acceptance that acknowledged no earthly sovereignty as ultimate or permanent. In the chamber's shadows, other priestesses maintained their individual devotions with movements that had been perfected through years of religious service that honored goddess energy older than any temporal empire that claimed administrative authority over Egyptian temple life. Some had served here since before Cleopatra's reign began. Others had arrived recently seeking sanctuary in religious vows that might protect them from whatever changes Roman occupation would impose on spiritual practices that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia. The eternal fire required constant attention through offerings that connected divine light to human devotion, regardless of which government claimed political jurisdiction over temple property, which administrators attempted to redirect religious income toward imperial priorities that served different gods through different ceremonies. Fire responded to spiritual care rather than political affiliation, burned brightly when fed by devotion that transcended immediate circumstances to serve purposes that acknowledged no temporal authority as ultimate. The evening prayers grew more fervent as darkness deepened around worship that maintained continuity with traditions that had sustained Egypt through foreign occupations that had attempted to reorganize religious practice according to imported theological preferences. Each priestess understood that they preserved connection with powers that would persist beyond any political change that might alter the external administration of temple affairs while leaving essential spiritual relationships intact. The sacred smoke carried prayers for those who served earthly authority, that royal duty might be fulfilled with dignity that honored both human choice and divine will, that endings might serve spiritual purposes that transformed apparent political defeat into religious victory that connected temporal sacrifice to eternal significance. Some requests transcended specific outcomes to ask only that whatever occurred might serve the goddess's larger purposes rather than merely human ambition that calculated advantage according to temporary considerations. As the priestesses completed their devotions with movements that had been perfected through generations of religious service, each understood that they had maintained connections with divine presence that would continue blessing Egypt regardless of which mortals claimed governmental authority over provisional political arrangements that served human necessity without touching the spiritual relationships that made such arrangements meaningful beyond their immediate practical utility. Olympus had sworn the ancient physician's oath to preserve life above all competing loyalties, but tonight his medical wisdom confronted moral complexities that no training had prepared him to resolve with the clarity that healing traditionally demanded. The compounds beneath his pestle had served therapeutic purposes throughout his 20-year career attending royal health, but this evening's preparations might require applications that served different definitions of medical service than simple preservation of biological function. His chamber contained remedies for every ailment that could afflict mortal flesh, tonics that restored strength to bodies weakened by the enormous stress of governing territories that stretched from Mediterranean shores to Nubian cataracts, salves that healed wounds inflicted by the political violence that characterized imperial competition, compounds that promoted the deep sleep that allowed exhausted minds to process information that exceeded normal human capacity for complexity. But what medicine served a patient whose deepest suffering came from circumstances that no herbal wisdom could address, whose greatest pain arose from choices that placed personal honor in permanent opposition to physical survival? The oath he had sworn as young physician had seemed straightforward when medical training taught clear distinctions between healing and harm, between preservation and destruction, between service that honored life and service that threatened it. But what did those principles mean when continued existence required accepting degradation that made death preferable? When healing might mean helping someone choose dignity over duration, when the highest medical service might involve providing gentle transition rather than desperate preservation. Roman physicians would soon control this palace, men trained in imperial methods that emphasized efficiency over the patient relationships that characterized Egyptian medical practice, with its emphasis on treating whole persons rather than isolated symptoms. Their approaches to healing reflected broader cultural differences between civilizations that viewed medicine as technical problem-solving versus traditions that understood physical wellness as inseparable from spiritual harmony that connected individual health to cosmic balance. In the corner, wrapped in silk that bore royal cartouches, lay preparations he had hoped never to use, compounds designed not for healing, but for the compassionate transition that sometimes represented the highest medical art when circumstances made life itself unbearable. Some medicines served existence by enabling dignified departure when existence had become suffering, when continuation meant enduring conditions that violated everything that made living worthwhile for people who possessed options that others could never access. The herbal combinations required careful consideration of effects that promoted peace rather than struggle, dosages that ensured swift passage rather than prolonged difficulty, methods that honored both medical ethics and human choice when normal definitions of healing no longer applied to circumstances that medical training had never envisioned. His hands had learned to heal through decades of service, but tonight they prepared for healing's deepest expression, release from situations that made preservation of life into preservation of suffering. The physician's art included recognizing when continuation of biological function became continuation of unbearable experience, when the highest service meant providing alternatives to circumstances that eliminated all choices except selecting the manner rather than the fact of conclusion. Some healing served life by enabling death chosen with awareness rather than death imposed by degradation. Some medicine achieved its greatest success by honoring patient autonomy when autonomy could only be expressed through ultimate personal decision. As he finished arrangements that might serve whatever the night required, Olympus understood that medical oath had prepared him for this moment, not to preserve breathing at any cost, but to serve healing in its deepest sense through providing options that honored both professional ethics and human dignity when circumstances had reduced choice to its most fundamental expression. The morning vendors arranged their displays with movements that had characterized Alexandria's commercial life for 3 centuries, though today their familiar routines carried undertones of uncertainty about currencies and regulations that would govern trade under Roman administration. The bread sellers positioned their loaves with care that reflected both professional pride and anxiety about taxation systems that might alter profit margins that had sustained Egyptian families through generations of independent commerce. Dawn boats arrived with catches that had been secured in waters now patrolled by foreign vessels conducting imperial business according to priorities that served distant Roman purposes rather than local Egyptian needs. The harbor buzzed with speculation about commercial policies that would affect ancient relationships between Alexandria's port and Mediterranean communities that had sustained economic partnerships since the city's founding by Alexander's successors. Mothers navigated market aisles while calling their offspring closer, young voices asking about soldiers who wore unfamiliar armor and spoke languages that transformed familiar streets into places that felt foreign despite unchanged stone surfaces and identical destinations. Roman guards now supervised intersections that had been managed by Egyptian authority since the city's establishment as capital of Ptolemaic administration that had balanced Greek culture with Egyptian traditions for 300 years. Cloth merchants calculated inventory values that might change if Roman imports competed with Egyptian textiles according to imperial trade policies that favored provincial workshops serving different aesthetic preferences, different cultural requirements for garments that expressed social status through foreign rather than local symbolic systems. They negotiated prices while wondering if traditional negotiations would continue under governmental supervision that might impose different commercial relationships between buyers and sellers. The central fountain continued its eternal music, unchanged by political mathematics that had transferred ownership of its water source from Egyptian public works to Roman municipal administration, that would maintain urban services according to imperial standards rather than local customs. Young voices still created joy in its spray, while parents conducted business that served identical human needs under different governmental supervision, fundamental requirements of food and shelter that persisted regardless of which authorities collected taxes to fund civic infrastructure. Conversations blended Egyptian dialect with Latin phrases as merchants learned to communicate with new customers who brought imperial silver, but different expectations about commercial relationships, different assumptions about proper balance between buyer authority and seller autonomy in negotiations that determined prices for goods that remained essentially unchanged despite altered political context. The ancient dance of commerce adapted to include new steps that accommodated different rhythms without abandoning the fundamental choreography of mutual benefit that made urban trade possible. Long-term residents recalled other occupations: Persian administrators, Greek governors, various foreign authorities that had claimed Alexandria, while life continued its essential patterns around unchanging requirements of human survival and community cooperation. They offered reassurance based on experience that empires changed while people's fundamental needs persisted, that markets adapted to serve those needs regardless of which governmental systems claimed authority over commercial regulation. Merchants positioned aromatic displays with extra attention to presentation, understanding that Roman palates might prefer different flavors while maintaining confidence that human desire for food that pleased the senses would continue under any political arrangement. Yet they wondered if traditional combinations that had defined local cuisine would retain popularity when imperial preferences influenced what customers expected from market vendors who had served Egyptian tastes for generations. As morning progressed, the market discovered its new patterns under changed circumstances, sellers and buyers learning that commercial relationships could bridge cultural differences when mutual benefit provided stronger foundations than political theory for practical cooperation that made urban life possible. Trade would continue because trade served purposes deeper than governmental allegiance, more persistent than political transition, more fundamental than cultural preference. The polished bronze showed Cleopatra's reflection with unforgiving clarity that revealed features that would be studied by Roman artists who had never witnessed the living expressions that transformed mere physical characteristics into the commanding presence of divine authority. She examined herself with analytical detachment that political necessity had taught her, seeing simultaneously the woman who had loved without calculation and the Pharaoh who had ruled with wisdom that circumstances had ultimately proven insufficient to preserve Egyptian independence. Through chamber windows came afternoon sounds of occupation proceeding with Roman efficiency, imperial commands mixing with Egyptian compliance, the inevitable conversations between conqueror and conquered that would establish new social patterns under administrative supervision that served different cultural values. The reflection revealed a face that had navigated such transitions before, had managed the complex diplomacy required to maintain Egyptian autonomy within expanding Roman influence since Caesar's galleys first entered Alexandria's harbor. Multiple mirrors created infinite repetitions of features that had launched diplomatic missions designed to preserve Egyptian independence through personal relationships with Roman leaders whose own loyalties were divided between imperial duty and individual affection. Each reflection showed different angles of a countenance that had provided physical presence for negotiations that attempted to transform political abstraction into personal connection with men who commanded legions but remained susceptible to intelligent conversation and genuine attraction. In the bronze surface, she recognized echoes of lovers who had shaped her reign through the dangerous mathematics of combining emotional investment with strategic alliance. Caesar's intellectual precision had taught her to calculate the political utility of personal relationships, while Antony's generous passion had demonstrated the intoxicating possibility of love that ignored practical considerations in favor of emotional authenticity that made private feeling into public spectacle. The woman in the mirror had learned to separate performance from genuine emotion, to maintain royal composure while experiencing the full range of human feeling that came from loving men whose political obligations made sustained personal relationships impossible within the constraints of imperial competition. Roman politicians faced their own difficult choices between heart and duty, their own struggles to maintain personal integrity while serving purposes larger than individual preference or emotional satisfaction. She traced the glass surface with fingertips that had signed treaties that attempted to balance Egyptian independence with Roman hegemony, had caressed lovers whose personal affection could not overcome their professional loyalty to imperial expansion that made provincial status inevitable for kingdoms that lacked sufficient military strength to enforce diplomatic equality. The reflection showed hands that had wielded authority as effectively as any pharaoh in Egyptian history, had managed resources with skill that might have created genuine partnership if political circumstances had favored negotiation over conquest. The mirror revealed features that had presented Egyptian interests in Roman councils, had argued for policies that might have preserved cultural diversity within imperial unity instead of the administrative absorption that transformed independent kingdoms into provincial territories governed according to standardized procedures. History would determine whether her diplomatic efforts had failed through personal miscalculation or had simply encountered forces too large for individual influence to redirect toward more accommodating conclusions. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the reflections seemed to multiply possibilities rather than limitations, showing not only present circumstances, but alternative outcomes that might have emerged if different choices had produced different results, if personal relationships had proven capable of reshaping imperial policy according to principles that valued cultural partnership over administrative uniformity. Tomorrow, Roman portraits would preserve physical details while missing entirely the intelligence that had animated those features, the determination that had made beauty into political instrument, the dignity that would transform ending into eternal legend. The aged papyrus whispered beneath her fingers as Cleopatra unrolled scrolls that preserved the handwriting of men whose physical presence had long since dissolved into memory, whose emotional impact had somehow outlived the bodies that had generated such powerful feelings. Caesar's precise Latin formed disciplined lines across Egyptian paper, each letter carved with mechanical precision that reflected his approach to everything: warfare, administration, the complex emotional relationships that he managed with strategic thinking he applied to conquering territories. The oldest correspondence bore marks from its Mediterranean journey 20 years ago, when alliance with Rome had seemed like partnership rather than preliminary step toward absorption into imperial administration that acknowledged no equals among Mediterranean powers. "My dearest ally," it began, though subsequent paragraphs revealed affection that transcended mere political convenience, intellectual attraction that had surprised them both with intensity that persisted beyond immediate strategic utility. She absorbed his detailed recommendations for Egyptian administrative reform, his suggestions for agricultural techniques that might increase productivity, his proposals for taxation systems that could fund military modernization while maintaining population loyalty through policies that balanced imperial efficiency with local customs. Even his love letters contained governmental advice, romantic correspondence that doubled as policy recommendations from a leader who could not separate personal feeling from strategic analysis of how individual relationships might serve larger political purposes. Antony's letters sprawled across papyrus with generous handwriting that reflected his approach to every aspect of life: excessive, enthusiastic, larger than conventional boundaries in ways that made cautious politicians uncomfortable but attracted hearts that valued emotional authenticity over practical calculation. His spelling remained atrocious, his grammar casual, his emotional directness absolute in ways that made Caesar's carefully measured affection seem diplomatic by comparison rather than genuinely felt. "You are my Alexandria," he had written with characteristic hyperbole that nevertheless carried literal truth. She had become for him the living embodiment of everything exotic and sophisticated about Egyptian civilization, the human symbol of luxury and cultural refinement that Rome pretended to despise while secretly envying. His correspondence overflowed with plans for joint rule that would combine Roman military efficiency with Egyptian cultural sophistication, political arrangements that would allow personal love to reshape international relationships according to principles that neither empire had previously considered practical. In Caesar's later letters, she detected growing awareness of his own vulnerability, careful planning by someone who understood that his radical reforms had created too many enemies among traditional Roman politicians who rewarded consensus rather than genius. He wrote detailed contingency arrangements for her safety, provisions for their son's future, practical preparations that love required when affection existed within dangerous political circumstances that made personal relationships into potential weapons against public figures. Antony's final communications grew increasingly urgent as military reality contradicted romantic optimism, as naval defeat at Actium made their shared dreams impossible rather than merely improbable. Yet even facing complete political disaster, he continued describing alternative futures, escape plans that might allow them to begin again in places where Roman authority could not reach, love stories that might continue beyond the collapse of imperial ambitions that had made their relationship possible. As she refolded the letters with reverent care, understanding that she held not just personal mementos but historical documents that revealed how individual emotions had influenced events that affected millions of people across the Mediterranean world, Cleopatra achieved final communication with loves that death had not diminished, affections that had survived the men who felt them and would now accompany her into whatever realm awaited departed pharaohs who had chosen honor over survival. Venus emerged in the twilight sky with punctual brilliance that had marked every evening since before human civilization began its ambitious project of organizing temporal existence around the illusion that mortal institutions could achieve permanent significance through military conquest or cultural achievement. Cleopatra observed the evening star's ascent from her private balcony, understanding that celestial patterns provided perspective that reduced individual catastrophes to brief interruptions in cosmic rhythms that acknowledged no earthly authority as ultimate or eternal in its claims to divine sanction. The Mediterranean stretched toward horizons that had witnessed countless civilizations attempting to transform geographical space into political possession, waters that had carried Phoenician innovation and Greek philosophy, Roman expansion, and Egyptian commerce, all the human enterprises that had tried to make temporary arrangements permanent through force or diplomacy or cultural influence. Tonight, those same waters reflected starlight that had illuminated Egyptian queens and Roman emperors, providing identical neutral illumination for all human efforts to create lasting meaning from ephemeral existence that ended for individuals while continuing for species. Evening breezes stirred silk hangings that would tomorrow be replaced by Roman textiles, but air itself served no imperial purpose, acknowledged no governmental authority, continued its ancient work of connecting all places through atmospheric democracy that made breathing possible regardless of political affiliation or cultural preference. Some forces remained permanently neutral in human conflicts, indifferent to claims of superiority that motivated territorial expansion, diplomatic negotiation, the complex calculations that made some nations attempt to dominate others through military or economic pressure. The first stars appeared in patterns that Egyptian priests had studied for millennia, celestial configurations that had guided agricultural planning and religious ceremonies since civilization began organizing itself around the Nile's predictable flooding, their positions unchanged by human tendency to assign different names according to various mythological systems that attempted to make cosmic relationships comprehensible through cultural storytelling. Roman astronomers would use different nomenclature for identical stellar arrangements, but stars themselves continued their eternal dance regardless of which languages attempted to capture astronomical relationships in temporarily meaningful words that served particular cultural requirements. The divinity that Egyptians called Isis had appeared as Venus in Greek astronomy, demonstrating how divine presence adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining essential identity that transcended specific religious practices or particular governmental arrangements that claimed spiritual authority. Tonight, the evening star would observe final ceremonies of pharaonic rule while preparing to illuminate whatever new forms of civilization would emerge from creative tension between Egyptian cultural traditions and Roman administrative innovation that might produce unprecedented synthesis. Palace gardens below retained their essential character regardless of which government claimed ownership, flowers blooming according to seasonal schedules that acknowledged no human authority, fountains splashing with musical persistence that had charmed visitors from across the Mediterranean world throughout Alexandria's 3-century history. Tomorrow, Roman administrators would conduct imperial business along these same paths, but gardens would continue serving their fundamental purpose, providing spaces where human beings could experience beauty that transcended immediate political concerns through contact with living things that grew according to natural rather than governmental principles. As complete darkness settled over Alexandria, with patient inevitability that characterized all natural transitions, the evening star achieved its brightest intensity, outshining surrounding celestial objects with steady radiance that had made it a symbol of reliability across multiple civilizations. Some forms of beauty persisted beyond imperial ambition. Some sources of illumination continued burning regardless of which mortals claimed temporary authority over provisional arrangements that served human necessity without touching the spiritual relationships that made such arrangements meaningful beyond their immediate practical utility. The star would witness tonight's endings while preparing to illuminate countless future stories that would unfold under its protection, providing the same reliable guidance for navigation, the same inspiration for lovers seeking signs, that personal feelings participated in patterns larger than individual experience, more permanent than any governmental system that claimed authority over human hearts. The star that Greeks had called Aphrodite and Romans would rename Venus carried the same divine presence under any designation, provided the same reliable illumination for navigation, the same inspiration for lovers who looked skyward, seeking signs that their personal feelings participated in patterns larger than individual experience, more permanent than earthly government. The private dining chamber had hosted 1,000 royal meals, but tonight Cleopatra, Iris, and Charmian shared what they understood without speaking would be their final feast together. They spoke of small things, the perfect ripeness of figs from the palace gardens, the honey's golden sweetness that had been gathered from hives maintained by the same family for 3 generations, the wine that carried the essence of Egyptian soil in every careful sip. The atmosphere held none of the formal protocol that usually governed royal meals, instead embracing the gentle domesticity that characterized relationships between women who had chosen devotion over survival, loyalty over the practical calculations that might have preserved individual lives at the cost of shared honor. Iris recalled the first time she had served the queen, a nervous 17-year-old who had dropped a golden goblet and waited for punishment that never came. Only patient instruction in the arts that transformed service into love expressed through careful attention to another person's comfort. Charmian described her arrival at the palace 15 years ago, fleeing a marriage arranged by parents who had valued political alliance over personal happiness, finding sanctuary in royal service that had provided the family relationships she had never experienced in her birth household. They had created their own forms of kinship through shared purpose, becoming sisters through choice rather than blood, daughters and mothers to each other as circumstances required emotional flexibility. The meal progressed with unconscious ceremony, each course received with appreciation that honored both the cook who had prepared it and the friendships that made sharing food into communion rather than simple nourishment. They ate slowly, savoring flavors that would never again combine in exactly these proportions, prepared by hands that understood the significance of this particular combination of ingredients, spices, and affection, made visible through culinary artistry. The conversation touched on practical matters with careful obliqueness, arrangements that had been made for servants who would survive tonight's conclusion, provisions for families who would need protection during the governmental transition, the small acts of generosity that characterized rulers who thought of their people's welfare even when facing circumstances that eliminated all personal alternatives, except choosing the manner of ending rather than avoiding ending itself. As the final course was completed and the serving dishes cleared by hands that moved with extra tenderness, the three women sat together in comfortable silence that spoke entire conversations about love that required no expression beyond presence, loyalty that needed no announcement beyond the simple decision to remain together when remaining together meant sharing whatever ceremony divine kingship would require from pharaohs who had chosen honor over degradation. The dining chamber settled around them like an embrace, candlelight creating shadows that danced with the gentle movements of women who had found in each other the family relationships that political circumstances had made impossible to maintain, with blood relatives who lived too far away to share the dangers that came from serving royal authority during times when royal authority itself had become impossible to maintain through conventional means. When they finally rose from the table where they had shared not just food, but the deeper nourishment that comes from being completely understood by other human beings, each woman carried the satisfaction that comes from relationships that had achieved their perfect expression through this final act of domestic ceremony, this ordinary meal that contained the extraordinary weight of choosing to love completely, despite knowing that such love would end before dawn brought Roman efficiency to palace chambers where Egyptian friendship had created its own forms of eternal meaning. The treasure chamber had never witnessed ceremonies quite like this evening's distribution, as Cleopatra presented personal valuables to servants whose loyalty had earned rewards that transcended monetary calculation. Each piece of jewelry carried specific memories that connected ornament to occasion. The bracelet worn during Caesarian's first steps, the earrings that had accompanied diplomatic triumphs, the rings that had sealed agreements that had temporarily preserved Egyptian independence through personal relationships with Roman leaders. Iris received the golden collar that had been commissioned to celebrate the alliance with Antony, its design incorporating both Egyptian and Roman symbols in artistic synthesis that had represented hope for cultural partnership rather than imperial absorption. She accepted it with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she held not just precious metal, but physical proof of royal affection that had transformed professional service into personal devotion that would persist beyond any political circumstances that might alter external arrangements. Charmian was given the pearl necklace that had belonged to Cleopatra's grandmother, connecting present loyalty to dynastic traditions that had sustained royal households through 3 centuries of challenges that had tested but never completely destroyed the relationships between pharaohs and the people who chose to serve pharaonic purposes rather than merely personal advancement. The pearls carried genetic memory of women who had understood that beauty could be a form of political statement, that choosing how to appear was choosing how to influence historical events through the accumulated power of individual decisions. The distribution continued through the evening as loyal servants received tokens that honored years of faithful service, while providing resources that might ease whatever transitions awaited them under Roman administration that would reorganize palace employment according to imperial staffing requirements. Each gift served dual purposes, expressing personal gratitude while offering practical assistance for people whose Egyptian identity might complicate their adjustment to serving Roman household management that emphasized efficiency over the personal relationships that had characterized pharaonic domestic arrangements. Helena received cooking implements that had been blessed during temple ceremonies, ensuring that her culinary skills would carry divine protection into whatever kitchens might employ her talents after Roman reorganization eliminated positions that had served specifically Egyptian royal preferences. The tools represented recognition that cooking was a form of love made visible, that feeding people well constituted religious service, regardless of which governmental system claimed authority over the political contexts within which such service was performed. The palace children who remained were given small treasures that could be hidden easily, portable wealth that might prove useful during uncertain futures, while serving as physical reminders that they had been valued by royal attention, that had noticed their individual personalities rather than treating them as interchangeable elements in domestic machinery. Each gift acknowledged that protecting innocence required providing resources as well as affection, practical assistance, as well as emotional support for young people facing displacement from the only home they had ever known. As the ceremony concluded with exchanges that had transformed material distribution into spiritual communion, everyone present understood that they had participated in something larger than simple generosity. They had maintained connections that would persist beyond political change, had honored relationships that Roman efficiency might reorganize, but could never completely destroy. Some gifts create obligations, some generosity establishes dependence, but tonight's distribution had strengthened the independence that came from being completely valued by another human being who possessed the authority to express such valuation through gestures that would outlast governmental transitions. The empty treasure chamber testified to royal priorities that had chosen human welfare over material preservation, relationships over resources, the accumulated wealth of affection over the temporary security that hoarding might have provided for individuals who faced uncertain futures with dignity rather than desperation, because they carried proof that their lives had mattered to someone whose judgment about human worth would be remembered long after Roman accountants finished cataloging whatever remained of pharaonic material culture. The throne room had witnessed 3 centuries of royal proclamations, but tonight's final commands carried weight that transformed administrative procedure into historical statement about the responsibilities that divine kingship maintained even when earthly authority approached its appointed limits. Cleopatra spoke her last royal orders with the same measured cadence that had characterized 22 years of governance, ensuring that her people's welfare would be protected during the transition that would reorganize Egyptian society according to Roman administrative principles. Her commands prioritized food security for Alexandria's poorest residents, directing palace stores to provide sustenance that would ease the adjustment period when Roman taxation might alter the economic relationships that had sustained urban populations through traditional Egyptian governmental policies. The decrees specified exact quantities and distribution methods, demonstrating the practical attention to detail that had made her reign effective in serving human needs rather than merely symbolic purposes that impressed foreign observers without improving domestic conditions. She canceled debts that had accumulated during the military campaigns that had attempted to preserve Egyptian independence, understanding that her people should not bear financial responsibility for political strategies that had failed to prevent the imperial absorption that made continued resistance impossible. The tax relief would provide economic space for families to adapt to Roman commercial policies that might impose different fiscal obligations while maintaining the basic prosperity that made cultural survival possible under foreign governmental supervision. Each decree was sealed with wax that bore her royal cartouche for the final time, creating legal documents that would bind Roman administrators to honor commitments made by Egyptian authority that had prioritized subject welfare over personal preservation. The commands demonstrated that effective leadership sometimes meant using remaining power to benefit others, rather than extending individual survival through arrangements that might preserve biological existence while abandoning the moral responsibilities that made such existence meaningful. Special provisions addressed the vulnerable populations who might face particular difficulties during governmental transition. Elderly residents who had limited capacity to learn new administrative procedures, disabled citizens who required specialized assistance that Roman efficiency might not automatically provide, orphaned children whose care had been subsidized by royal household resources that would be redirected toward imperial purposes under occupation. The final proclamations established foundations that would continue serving Egyptian cultural purposes regardless of which governmental system claimed political authority over the territories where such service was performed. Schools that taught Egyptian literature, temples that maintained traditional religious practices, workshops that preserved artisanal techniques, all received endowments that would fund their operations through whatever political changes might alter their external circumstances, while protecting their essential cultural functions. As the last decree was recorded by scribes who understood that they documented the final exercise of pharaonic authority in Egypt, everyone present recognized that they had witnessed leadership that honored its highest obligations, even when honoring such obligations provided no personal benefit to the leader who chose duty over alternative arrangements that might have preserved individual life through cooperation with foreign powers that offered survival in exchange for abandoning the principles that made survival worth maintaining. The throne room settled into silence that acknowledged the completion of governmental service that had demonstrated how authority could be used to protect those who possessed no power to protect themselves. how royal responsibility could be fulfilled through decisions that served subject welfare rather than ruler preservation. Some commands outlast the rulers who issue them. Some leadership achieves its perfect expression through final acts that honor the people who had made such leadership possible by offering their loyalty to purposes larger than individual advantage or temporary security that came at the cost of cultural integrity. Ketty entered the queen's private chamber carrying the ceremonial basket with reverence that 7 generations of temple service had perfected into spiritual art, understanding that he brought not merely a creature, but the physical embodiment of divine mercy that would enable transformation rather than simple ending. The chamber had been prepared according to ancient protocols that connected present ceremony to 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition, ensuring that tonight's ritual would honor both individual choice and cosmic order that acknowledged death as transition rather than termination. The sacred asp stirred within its consecrated container with movements that seemed to acknowledge the approaching fulfillment of its ancient purpose, the completion of religious service for which generations of temple keepers had prepared these creatures through patient training that honored their role as divine intermediaries. This particular aspi had been fed on royal offerings, blessed by royal prayers, maintained through careful attention that connected its existence to goddess purposes that transcended political circumstances while serving spiritual necessities that no earthly authority could eliminate through administrative reorganization. Ketty arranged the traditional accompaniments with precision that transformed preparation into prayer. Bread blessed in Isis's temple, wine consecrated according to formulas that had sanctified royal departures since the first pharaoh had learned that divine kingship sometimes required divine departure when temporal circumstances made continued earthly rule incompatible with spiritual obligations. Each element served symbolic purposes that connected physical ceremony to metaphysical transformation, ensuring that apparent ending would actually constitute beginning of eternal service that honored goddess will rather than merely human preference. The temple texts had provided clear guidance about royal transformation when political mathematics eliminated all alternatives that preserved both life and honor. The gods had created these options that maintained spiritual continuity while acknowledging temporal defeat. These ceremonial possibilities that honored Egyptian traditions while accepting limitations that made earthly resistance impossible. Tonight, religious preparation would demonstrate its practical value through creatures that embodied goddess mercy, living prayers that had been trained to serve purposes larger than biological existence. Cleopatra received the basket with composure that reflected her acceptance of ceremony rather than surrender to defeat, transformation rather than mere termination of biological function that had served divine purposes for 39 years. Her hands showed no tremor as she acknowledged the gift that would enable her to complete pharaonic responsibility through methods that honored both Egyptian spiritual traditions and personal choice that refused to accept survival at the cost of everything that made survival meaningful. The chamber filled with presence that transcended the immediate participants to include all the pharaohs who had faced similar choices, all the royal women who had chosen honor over degradation, all the servants who had facilitated such choices through religious service that connected temporal decision to eternal significance. Some moments become gateways between worlds. Some ceremonies open passages that allow individual choice to serve cosmic purposes that acknowledge no earthly authority as ultimate in its claims to determine how human stories should conclude. as Keti withdrew with the satisfaction that came from completing religious duty that had required 7 generations of preparation. He understood that he had facilitated not tragedy, but triumph, not ending, but beginning of story that would outlast any political arrangement that claimed authority over Egyptian soil. The basket rested in royal hands that would complete the ceremony with dignity that honored both human choice and divine provision that made such choice possible when conventional alternatives had been eliminated by forces too large for individual resistance to overcome through purely earthly means. Tonight, ancient traditions would prove their worth through enabling transformation that converted apparent defeat into spiritual victory, political ending into eternal beginning that would inspire other pharaohs in other times who faced similar choices between survival that required abandoning everything meaningful and departure that preserved everything essential through methods that honored both individual dignity and cultural continuity that transcended any particular historical moment. Before the private shrine that had provided spiritual anchor throughout 22 years of governing territories that stretched from Mediterranean shores to Nubian cataracts, Cleopatra knelt to offer final prayers that served Egypt rather than personal salvation. The oil lamps cast steady light across images of Isis and Osiris, while incense carried her words toward divine attention that had blessed Egyptian independence since before human memory began recording royal responsibilities that connected earthly authority to cosmic purpose. She spoke in hieroglyphic phrases that linked present petition to the very foundation of pharaonic spirituality, using sacred words that had been preserved through 3 millennia of foreign pressure that had tested but never completely destroyed the spiritual relationships that made Egyptian civilization more than merely another territorial arrangement subject to imperial reorganization. Her appeals requested protection for the people who would wake tomorrow to find themselves governed by Roman efficiency rather than pharaonic tradition that had balanced administrative necessity with cultural preservation. Great Isis, Mother of Protection, guard those who serve divine kingship faithfully, she whispered, asking the goddess to extend her blessing to servants who had maintained palace traditions, craftsmen who had preserved Egyptian artistic techniques, priests who had continued religious observances that connected temporal existence to eternal purposes, that acknowledged no earthly authority as ultimate in its spiritual claims. Her words sought divine assistance for cultural survival rather than political restoration. Understanding that some forms of independence could persist despite governmental change that altered external circumstances while leaving essential relationships intact. Special attention was given to royal offspring who carried Egyptian blood in their veins, despite facing futures that would require them to navigate Roman educational systems, marriage arrangements, career opportunities that might value their genetic heritage while demanding loyalty to imperial purposes that served different gods through different ceremonies. She requested goddess guidance for Caesarion, for the twins she shared with Antony, for all the royal children whose survival would depend on their ability to honor Egyptian traditions while adapting to Roman expectations that might conflict with pharaonic principles. Her prayers encompassed the entire territory that had acknowledged pharaonic authority, from Alexandria's sophisticated urban culture to rural communities that had maintained traditional agricultural practices, from Nubian trading posts that connected Egypt to African commerce to Mediterranean ports that had linked Egyptian prosperity to international networks of cultural and economic exchange. She asked that whatever remained essentially Egyptian, would find ways to persist under Roman administration that emphasized uniformity over the diversity that had made Egyptian civilization a synthesis of multiple influences rather than merely territorial control. The longest petition addressed the goddess's eternal knowledge about historical patterns that transcended individual human experience, requesting understanding about how apparent endings could serve larger purposes that individual participants could never comprehend completely. She sought spiritual insight that would transform personal sacrifice into service of divine will that operated according to principles larger than political calculation or emotional preference, purposes that acknowledged temporary arrangements as temporary while maintaining eternal relationships as eternal. As the final words were spoken in darkness that seemed to expand around sacred flame rather than threatening to extinguish it, Cleopatra experienced the peace that came from completing spiritual preparation for transition that would carry her from earthly queenship into whatever realm awaited pharaohs who had chosen honor over survival. Some prayers request specific outcomes. Some appeals ask for divine intervention in human affairs, but tonight's petitions had sought only that whatever occurred might serve goddess purposes rather than merely personal preference or political calculation that valued temporary advantage over eternal significance. The shrine seemed to pulse with presence that transcended the immediate ceremony to include all the royal women who had faced similar choices, all the pharaohs who had discovered that effective leadership sometimes required enabling endings that served beginnings too large for individual comprehension. Divine attention had been invoked, spiritual protection requested, and royal responsibility fulfilled through prayer that honored both individual choice and cosmic order that acknowledged death as transformation rather than termination of service that connected temporal authority to eternal purpose. The gentle rhythm of brush through hair had provided comfort through 15 years of evening preparations, but tonight Iris's careful attention carried ceremonial weight that transformed ordinary grooming into sacred ritual between women who had chosen shared destiny over individual survival. Each strand was arranged with precision that honored both the queen who would wear the results and the traditions that made royal appearance into political statement about dignity that persisted regardless of external circumstances that might threaten to reduce majesty to mere mortality. The elaborate hairstyle required the complex techniques that Iris had mastered through years of practice, weaving golden ornaments into patterns that had been worn by 11 queens before Cleopatra, ensuring continuity with dynastic traditions that connected present ceremony to 3 centuries of royal women who had understood that beauty could be a form of resistance against forces that attempted to diminish Egyptian cultural authority. Each decorative element was positioned according to protocols that honored both aesthetic consideration and spiritual significance, that made royal grooming into religious observance rather than simple vanity. They spoke softly of memories that had shaped their relationship. The first time Iris had successfully managed the complicated crown that required perfect balance, the morning after Caesarion's birth, when exhausted joy had made royal protocol seem less important than maternal satisfaction, the evening before departing for Tarsus, when anticipation about meeting Antony had made even experienced hands tremble slightly while arranging jewelry that would accompany diplomatic seduction. Their shared recollections created soundtrack for ceremony that celebrated friendship as much as duty, love as much as service. The final fragrance was chosen not for its seductive properties, but for its connection to temple ceremonies that honored Isis as protector of royal women who faced circumstances that required divine assistance rather than merely human wisdom. The oil had been blessed by priestesses who understood the spiritual dimensions of physical preparation that served purposes larger than aesthetic improvement, transformation that connected mortal flesh to immortal purpose through attention to details that honored both individual choice and cosmic order. In the polished bronze mirrors that multiplied their images endlessly, both women observed the completion of transformation that had been their collaborative masterpiece throughout years of preparing for public appearances that required presenting Egyptian sophistication to foreign observers who judged civilizations by the elegance of their royal representatives. Tonight's result demonstrated their combined artistry at its highest expression, royal appearance that would be remembered by whatever witnesses observed the final ceremonies of pharaonic authority in Egypt. As the last ornament was secured and the final adjustments made to fabric that had been arranged with love as much as skill, Iris stepped back to admire work that represented the culmination of devotion that had transformed professional service into personal ministry. Her hands had learned to create beauty through patient attention to another person's needs, service that had achieved the status of art through repetition, guided by affection that sought perfection not for personal recognition, but for honor of the relationship that made such effort meaningful. The chamber filled with presence that acknowledged the ending of rituals that had provided structure and meaning to daily life for two women who had discovered that loyalty could become love, that service could achieve dignity through persistence, that choosing to remain together during impossible circumstances could transform practical arrangement into spiritual partnership. Some relationships outlast the circumstances that created them. Some devotion transcends the immediate purposes it was designed to serve. Some love expresses itself most completely through final acts that honor shared commitment over individual preservation. When the preparation was complete and royal appearance had achieved its perfect expression through techniques that honored both Egyptian artistic traditions and personal affection between women who had chosen each other as family, both understood that they had participated in ceremony that would be their final collaboration in creating beauty that served purposes larger than individual preference or temporal consideration, that valued appearance over the spiritual relationships that made such attention to appearance into forms of prayer. The ancient palace had learned to sleep gradually, each chamber finding its own rhythm as stone walls cooled from the day's heat and marble floors released warmth that had been gathered from Egyptian sun that would rise tomorrow on different arrangements. Despite tomorrow's uncertainties, human bodies required rest according to biological schedules that acknowledged no political authority, served no imperial purpose, continued demanding sleep regardless of governmental transitions that might alter every other aspect of daily existence. Even Apollodorus's most disciplined soldiers found their eyelids growing heavy as midnight approached, their bodies insisting on rest despite mental alertness that training had taught them to maintain during watches that might determine the safety of people they had sworn to protect. Their equipment settled around them as they adjusted positions that allowed vigilance without preventing the physical recovery that would be necessary regardless of what dawn might bring to palace corridors that had sheltered pharaonic authority for 3 centuries. In quarters that housed the people who maintained palace operations through cooking, cleaning, administrative tasks that kept royal households functioning according to standards that had impressed foreign visitors throughout Cleopatra's reign. Exhausted bodies surrendered to sleep that carried them into dreams where familiar routines continued unchanged by political circumstances that would reorganize everything when morning brought Roman efficiency to Egyptian domestic arrangements. Children who had played in palace courtyards until evening fell asleep clutching toys that might be their only possessions when they woke to discover that their world had been transformed during hours of unconsciousness. The palace settled into acoustic patterns that had characterized evening for generations. Distant conversations dying away into whispers, footsteps growing softer as people moved toward sleeping chambers, the gradual silence that came when human activity yielded to natural rhythms that required restoration through unconsciousness that served biological necessity rather than voluntary choice. From palace gardens came the eternal night music of creatures whose schedules acknowledged no human authority, whose activities continued according to patterns that had persisted since before Alexandria's founding. Oil lamps burned lower as fuel was conserved for morning tasks that would require illumination for whatever reorganization Roman administration would impose on palace operations that had served pharaonic purposes according to Egyptian customs that emphasized cultural continuity over administrative efficiency. The approaching darkness seemed peaceful rather than threatening, offering respite from emotional intensity that had characterized preparation for ceremonies that required psychological readiness as much as practical arrangement. In sleeping chambers throughout the palace, loyal servants experienced the deep rest that came from completing service with honor, from maintaining dignity during circumstances that had tested but not broken their commitment to purposes larger than personal survival or individual advantage that might have been preserved through cooperation with foreign authorities who offered security in exchange for abandoning cultural loyalty. Their sleep was the sleep of people who had chosen correctly, when choice meant deciding between comfort and honor, between survival and integrity, between personal preservation and spiritual continuity. The palace that had witnessed 3 centuries of royal celebration and political crisis, diplomatic triumph and military defeat, personal joy and imperial tragedy settled into rest that acknowledged completion rather than mere interruption, ending rather than temporary pause in activities that would resume under different management, according to different priorities. Some buildings absorb the emotional history of people who have lived within their walls. Some architecture holds memory that transcends the particular purposes for which it was originally constructed. As complete silence finally settled over chambers that had echoed with Egyptian voices conducting Egyptian business according to Egyptian customs that honored 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition, the palace achieved the profound peace that came from understanding that some purposes had been fulfilled completely, some service had achieved its perfect expression, some stories had reached their appointed conclusion with dignity that honored both the people who had lived those stories and the buildings that had sheltered their living. Charmian sat in the antechamber's darkness with patience that had been refined through 15 years of understanding when presence mattered more than action, when silent witness provided greater service than helpful intervention. The comfortable seat had been positioned to allow observation without intrusion, enabling her to maintain protective watch while honoring the solitude that final preparation sometimes required from people facing transitions that demanded complete personal readiness rather than assisted ceremony. Her own respiration found rhythm that matched the palace's nocturnal quiet, unconscious synchronization with building sounds that had provided acoustic backdrop for countless nights when royal duty had required staying awake while others slept, maintaining alert attention during hours when most palace residents surrendered consciousness to dreams that offered temporary escape from whatever complexities characterized their waking responsibilities. The silk of her garments rustled softly when she adjusted position, creating gentle percussion that marked time's passage without disturbing the essential silence that final hours seemed to require. Memory moved through scenes that had defined their relationship, ceremonial occasions when perfect coordination had been essential for presentations that impressed foreign dignitaries, private moments when shared understanding had eliminated the need for verbal communication about preparations that served emotional necessity as much as practical requirement. They had developed forms of communication that transcended spoken language, achieving intimacy that honored both professional boundaries and personal affection that had grown from mutual respect into something approaching sisterhood between women who had chosen each other as family. The hours moved with liquid smoothness that characterized waiting that served clear purpose, consciousness that remained alert without becoming anxious about outcomes that had already been determined through processes larger than individual preference or emotional resistance. This was service in its most essential form, simple presence that asked nothing, offered everything, provided the gift of witnessed time without attempting to influence how such time would be used by the person who required space for private communion with whatever spiritual preparation their situation demanded. Each moment of maintained vigil demonstrated devotion that had transcended employment to become vocation, service that had evolved beyond practical necessity to achieve the status of religious observance that honored both the person who received such attention and the relationship that made such attention meaningful beyond its immediate practical utility. Some affection expresses itself through dramatic gesture, some devotion announces itself through elaborate ceremony, but tonight's vigil achieved its perfect expression through the simple gift of faithful presence that required no acknowledgement or reward beyond the knowledge that it had been offered completely. Through the closed door came occasional sounds that suggested ongoing activity, movement that indicated preparation rather than rest, the quiet efficiency that characterized someone completing tasks that demanded careful attention to detail. Charmian made no attempt to discover specifics about activities that had been designated private, understanding that effective loyalty sometimes meant providing protection through ignorance rather than assistance through knowledge that might create obligation to participate in decisions that belonged entirely to individual conscience. The antechamber seemed to expand around her presence, darkness becoming welcoming rather than oppressive, as waiting achieved the meditative quality that transformed time from burden into gift, duration from endurance into opportunity for reflection, that honored both past relationship and present service. Some vigils become prayers without requiring specific petitions. Some watching achieves spiritual significance through persistence that demonstrates faith in purposes larger than immediate comprehension. As the night progressed toward whatever dawn would bring to palace chambers that had sheltered their friendship through years of shared service, Charmian maintained her patient watch with satisfaction that came from offering presence without conditions, loyalty without reservations, love without expectations beyond the simple privilege of being trusted to provide such gifts when they were needed most by the person whose welfare had become inseparable from her own understanding of what made existence meaningful beyond mere survival or personal advantage. In the perfect privacy of her chamber, Cleopatra experienced the profound quiet that came when external demands finally yielded to internal necessity, when royal performance gave way to personal truth that required no audience except consciousness itself. The familiar rhythm provided soundtrack for reflection that encompassed 39 years of existence that had been dedicated to purposes larger than individual preference, responsibilities that had shaped every decision according to obligations that connected personal choice to cultural survival. The evening air carried scents that had defined her private world, jasmine from gardens she had designed, incense from shrines that had provided spiritual anchor during political crises, the subtle perfume that had become her signature through diplomatic negotiations that had attempted to preserve Egyptian independence through personal relationships with Roman leaders whose affection had proven insufficient to overcome imperial mathematics. Each inhalation brought recollections that needed final acknowledgement before consciousness prepared for whatever transition awaited pharaohs who had chosen honor over survival. The woman who had loved Caesar's intellectual precision while calculating the political utility of personal attraction, who had surrendered to Antony's generous passion while understanding the strategic implications of emotional authenticity, who had borne children whose royal blood made them targets rather than treasures in the dangerous politics of imperial succession. This same woman now faced the essential aloneness that accompanied every human being's ultimate transition, regardless of how many people had shared the journey toward this moment. Love had been real, power had been exercised wisely, cultural preservation had been attempted with skill and determination, but finally each consciousness must encounter eternity individually. 22 years of governance had demonstrated that effective leadership could balance Egyptian cultural preservation with Roman political reality, that diplomatic skill could extend independence longer than military resistance might have achieved, that personal relationships could influence imperial policy when guided by intelligence rather than mere emotional appeal. The library had been protected, artistic traditions had been maintained, religious practices had continued. The people had prospered under administration that had honored both practical necessity and spiritual continuity that connected temporal existence to eternal purpose. Some possibilities had proven impossible: genuine partnership with Rome rather than provincial absorption, survival for royal children who carried genetic heritage that made them perpetual threats to imperial security, continuation of dynastic traditions that had connected Egyptian present to 3,000-year past. Yet attempting those impossibilities had been worth the effort they had required, worth the risks they had entailed, worth the ultimate cost they had demanded from someone who understood that some failures honored the attempt more than success might have honored capitulation to circumstances that eliminated cultural dignity along with political independence. The chamber that had witnessed personal joy and private sorrow, diplomatic planning and maternal tenderness, the full range of human experience that characterized rulers who remained human despite wielding authority over territories and populations too large for individual comprehension, now provided space for final preparation that acknowledged both mortal limitation and immortal aspiration. This was not defeat, but completion, not surrender, but transformation from earthly queenship into whatever form of eternal service awaited pharaohs who had fulfilled their obligations with wisdom, courage, and love for the people whose welfare had been entrusted to their care. In darkness that seemed welcoming rather than threatening, surrounded by silence that offered rest rather than emptiness, Cleopatra achieved integration of lifetime experience that prepared consciousness for transition from individual existence to whatever universal participation awaited souls who had served purposes larger than personal preference or temporal consideration. Some moments require solitude for completion, some preparation demands privacy for proper achievement. Some transitions need individual readiness that no assistance can provide except through the gift of space for personal communion with eternal realities that acknowledge no earthly authority as ultimate in their spiritual significance. The ceremonial basket opened with whispered sound that seemed to echo from temple ceremonies conducted since the first pharaoh learned that divine kingship sometimes required divine departure, when earthly circumstances made continued rule incompatible with spiritual obligations. The sacred serpent moved with ancient purpose, carrying religious authority that connected present ceremony to 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition that had understood transformation as continuation rather than termination of service to purposes larger than individual biological existence. This was not tragedy, but completion of pattern that had been established when gods first blessed Egyptian rulers with divine authority that included responsibility for choosing departure timing when political mathematics eliminated all alternatives that preserved both life and honor. The ASP had been prepared through generations of temple service for exactly this purpose, trained to serve as bridge between temporal existence and eternal significance through methods that honored both human choice and cosmic order, that acknowledged death as transition rather than ending. Cleopatra received the serpent's approach with composure that reflected understanding rather than resignation, spiritual preparation that had transformed necessity into ceremony, duty into devotion that honored both personal dignity and cultural continuity that would outlast any particular historical moment. Her breathing remained steady as ancient ritual began its work, consciousness maintaining clarity that allowed complete participation in processes that connected individual choice to eternal purpose through means that had been sanctified by religious tradition. The chamber filled with spiritual attendants that included all the pharaohs who had faced similar transitions, all the royal women who had chosen honor over degradation, all the servants who had facilitated such choices through religious service that maintained connections between temporal decision and eternal significance. Some moments become gateways between worlds. Some ceremonies open passages that allow individual sacrifice to serve cosmic purposes that acknowledge no earthly authority as ultimate in determining how royal stories should conclude. The physical transition proceeded with gentleness that honored both the person who had requested such assistance and the divine mercy that made such assistance possible when conventional alternatives had been eliminated by forces too large for human resistance to overcome. Awareness moved gradually from earthly concerns toward spiritual realities that had always existed beyond political circumstances, beyond personal relationships, beyond the temporal arrangements that had provided structure for individual existence while serving purposes that transcended such arrangements. What had been mortal flesh began transformation into eternal legend, royal authority evolving from earthly limitation into cosmic participation that would inspire other leaders facing similar choices between survival that required abandoning meaningful principles and departure that preserved essential values through transition to realms where such values achieved perfect expression. The pharaoh who had refused to live as Roman client became the queen who chose Egyptian dignity, individual decision, serving cultural continuity through methods that honored both personal autonomy and divine provision. In chambers that had witnessed 22 years of governance devoted to balancing practical necessity with spiritual obligation, temporal authority achieved its perfect expression through final acts that demonstrated how effective leadership could honor both human limitation and divine aspiration. The physical form that had served pharaonic purposes with wisdom and courage was released to whatever transformation awaited rulers who had fulfilled their responsibilities completely, who had chosen honor over convenience, who had maintained dignity even when dignity required ultimate sacrifice. As consciousness moved beyond individual boundary toward universal participation, the woman who had been Egypt's final pharaoh became the legend who would demonstrate for future generations that some defeats were actually victories when they preserved everything essential while acknowledging temporal limitation. Ancient ceremony achieved its purpose through enabling transformation that converted apparent ending into eternal beginning, political conclusion into spiritual triumph that would outlast any earthly empire that claimed authority over provisional arrangements serving temporary purposes. Iris and Charmian approached their queen's resting place with steps that carried the weight of decision that honored loyalty over survival, devotion over the practical calculations that might have preserved individual lives at the cost of abandoning relationships that had provided meaning beyond mere existence. They moved with quiet dignity that demonstrated how freely chosen service could achieve the status of religious observance when performed by people who understood that some connections transcended biological preservation. The arrangements had been prepared with care that honored both their personal choice and the friendship that had made such choice possible through years of shared service that had created bonds stronger than family relationships, deeper than professional obligation, more enduring than any political circumstance that might alter external conditions while leaving essential affection intact. Tonight, devotion would achieve its perfect expression through final acts that demonstrated how love could transform necessity into privilege, ending into beginning of stories that would outlast any historical documentation. They settled beside their queen with movements that suggested completion rather than termination, fulfillment rather than mere conclusion of service that had evolved from employment into vocation, from duty into spiritual practice that honored both the relationships that had sustained them and the purposes those relationships had served. Their faces showed peace rather than sorrow, understanding rather than desperation, the profound calm that characterized people who faced transition with complete certainty about the correctness of choices that honored love over logic. No words were required to communicate what they all comprehended perfectly, that some loyalties demanded expression through actions that acknowledged no external authority as sufficient to override commitments made freely between human beings who had chosen each other as family. The chamber filled with presents that celebrated relationships achieved rather than mourning connections terminated, honoring bonds that had been strengthened rather than broken by circumstances that had tested but not destroyed their essential integrity. The sacred serpent that had served divine purpose for their queen would serve identical purpose for companions who had earned equal honor through service that had demonstrated love's capacity to transform practical arrangement into spiritual partnership. Tonight, royal authority and loyal service would be acknowledged as different expressions of identical commitment to purposes larger than individual preservation. Different roles serving identical dedication to cultural continuity that valued relationships over mere survival. As ceremony proceeded with gentleness that honored both their personal choice and divine mercy that made such choice possible when alternatives had been eliminated by forces beyond human control, consciousness began moving gradually from individual awareness toward whatever universal participation awaited souls who had fulfilled their obligations through perfect love. The physical transition carried none of the struggle that might have characterized resistance, instead flowing with natural rhythm that suggested homecoming rather than departure. The chamber settled into quiet that celebrated completion rather than mourning termination, acknowledging relationship that had achieved its perfect expression through final acts that honored both personal autonomy and mutual affection that had sustained three women through circumstances that had tested but never broken their commitment to each other. Some partnerships outlast the conditions that created them. Some devotion transcends temporal limitation. Some friendship achieves immortality through shared dedication to purposes that acknowledge individual choice while serving universal significance. In rooms that had witnessed the daily development of relationship, that had evolved from service into sisterhood, from professional obligation into personal ministry, three women achieved transition that would be remembered as demonstration of how human beings could choose love over fear, honor over convenience, spiritual significance over biological preservation when circumstances demanded final expression of values that had guided their shared existence toward this moment of perfect completion where individual choice served eternal purpose. The first pale light touched Alexandria's harbor with the same patient inevitability that had marked every sunrise since Alexander chose this ground for his city, unchanged by human political arrangements that had attempted to claim permanent authority over temporary circumstances. The eternal conversation between sea and shore continued with rhythms that acknowledged no governmental jurisdiction, served no imperial purpose, maintained patterns that had persisted since before human civilization began organizing itself around the illusion that mortal institutions could control natural forces. Fishermen prepared their nets for morning expeditions that would serve Roman markets according to imperial commercial policies, yet the fish themselves remained Egyptian. The Mediterranean stayed neutral in human conflicts. The ancient relationship between harbor and sea continued serving purposes larger than any particular political arrangement that claimed sovereignty over activities that predated all earthly empires. Merchants opened stalls that would display goods for Roman customers, but the fundamental human needs that made trade necessary persisted unchanged by governmental transition that reorganized administration while leaving essential relationships intact. Children who had played Egyptian games yesterday would learn Roman customs today, yet childhood itself remained constant in its capacity to find joy in new circumstances, to create meaning from changed conditions, to discover friendship across cultural boundaries that adults constructed but young hearts routinely transcended. The palace courtyards that had fallen silent during the night would soon echo with different voices speaking different languages, but the stones themselves would provide identical acoustic qualities for whatever games children invented to fill spaces that had been designed for play, regardless of which governmental system claimed authority over their supervision. Roman administrators arrived to begin organizational tasks that would transform Egyptian palace into imperial provincial headquarters. Yet, the building itself adapted to new purposes with the flexibility that characterized architecture designed to serve human needs rather than specific political functions. The corridors that had carried Egyptian conversations would accommodate Latin discussions with identical acoustic properties. The chambers that had sheltered pharaonic authority would house Roman governance with unchanged structural integrity. Alexandria awakened to discover that essential rhythms persisted despite political change that had seemed total during nighttime hours when transformation occurred beyond public observation. In private chambers where individual choice had honored cultural values through methods that preserved spiritual continuity while acknowledging temporal limitation. The city that had been entirely Egyptian yesterday was becoming something new today, not Roman, not Egyptian, but Alexandrian, in the synthetic way that successful urban centers always transcended their founding cultures to create inclusive identities that honored multiple traditions simultaneously. Market vendors discovered that Roman customers valued many of the same products that had sustained Egyptian commerce, that human needs transcended political boundaries, that cultural exchange could enrich both populations when conducted with mutual respect rather than imperial domination. The harbor sounds that had been purely Egyptian at sunset now included Roman voices conducting business according to different procedures, while serving identical human requirements for food, shelter, beautiful objects that made existence pleasant rather than merely sustainable. As morning light strengthened across water that had carried Egyptian independence toward Roman authority during hours of darkness, the Mediterranean resumed its eternal work of connecting diverse cultures through commerce, communication, the various forms of exchange that made isolation impossible and cultural synthesis inevitable. Alexandria prepared to discover what new forms of civilization might emerge from creative tension between Egyptian traditions and Roman innovations, cultural combinations that neither empire had previously imagined possible. The harbor that had witnessed Cleopatra's final night as Egypt's pharaoh now reflected sunrise that would illuminate whatever stories would unfold under Roman administration that might prove more accommodating to Egyptian cultural preservation than conquest had initially suggested. Some changes that appear complete prove partial. Some endings enable beginnings that honor the past while creating unprecedented futures. Some transformations preserve essential elements while adapting surface arrangements to serve larger purposes that individual participants cannot comprehend during moments of apparent conclusion. Journey through history's most pivotal moments with our immersive audio experiences. Subscribe for stories that bring legendary figures to life through intimate literary storytelling that honors both historical truth and the power of peaceful narrative.